That night, a $40 million private jet was minutes from takeoff. Investors were already buckled in. The engines were warming up, and a young woman was holding the future of her entire company in trembling hands. Then a man stepped forward, not a hero, not a millionaire, just an aircraft inspector in a wrinkled uniform, and said the words that froze every single person in that hangar. "Get everyone off the plane. Nobody flies tonight." This is the story of what honesty actually costs, and why sometimes a crack so small you almost miss it can save everyone. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't go anywhere, because what happened that night changed aviation forever. The call came at 6:47 in the evening. Liam Carter was standing at his kitchen counter, stirring mac and cheese with one hand and holding his phone against his ear with the other, half listening to his son argue from the living room about whether superheroes could theoretically survive a fall from a commercial airplane. Dad, if the Flash ran fast enough on the way down, would he— Hold that thought, bud. He set the spoon down and checked the screen. It was dispatch. He almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Carter? Liam. It was Sandra from the regional office, and even through the phone he could hear the particular strain in her voice that meant someone higher up the chain had already been making calls. "We need you at Meridian Aviation, private terminal, South Hangar. There's a pre-flight sign-off needed on a Whitmore G7. Owners pushing hard for a 9 p.m. departure." Liam exhaled through his nose. "Sandra, I've got my kid. I know. I'm sorry. The on-call inspector called in sick, and you're next on the rotation. The owner's team has been calling every 15 minutes. A pause. "She's Ava Sinclair." The name registered. Anyone who followed business news even casually knew that name. CEO of Sinclair Aerotech. 30 years old, had taken the company from a mid-tier parts supplier to one of the most talked-about names in private aerospace in under 4 years. Her face had been on 3 magazine covers in the last year alone. "I'll be there in 40, Liam said. He turned off the burner, poured the mac and cheese into a bowl, and carried it to the living room where his son, Noah, was sprawled across the carpet with a comic book open on his chest. Noah was 9. He had his mother's eyes, dark and wide, and always looking at something just slightly beyond whatever was directly in front of him, and Liam's stubborn jaw. He was at that age where he asked questions constantly, about everything, with the kind of relentless precision that made Liam feel both exhausted and quietly proud. "I've got to go in," Liam said, setting the bowl on the coffee table. "Mrs. Delgado next door said she'd watch you if I needed her tonight. I'll call her." Noah sat up and looked at the bowl, then at his father. "Is it the crack kind or the real kind?" "What?" "Mac and cheese, the kind from a box or the kind you actually make?" "The box kind." Noah considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old evaluating genuine moral trade-offs. "Okay. Is it important? The work thing?" Liam grabbed his jacket from the back of the couch. "It might be, yeah." Okay. Noah picked up the bowl. "Tell me about it when you get home." That was one of the things about Noah that Liam had never quite figured out how to explain to people. The kid didn't complain. He just asked you to tell him about it later, and then he actually remembered to ask. Meridian Aviation's South Terminal was 45 minutes from Liam's apartment in light traffic, and the traffic that evening was anything but light. He sat in a slow crawl on the I-94 on-ramp for 12 minutes, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, his inspection bag on the passenger seat beside him. The bag was worn at the corners. He'd had it for 11 years. Inside, a flashlight with 3 different heads, a set of precision mirrors, a digital bore scope, inspection templates, a torque wrench, documentation forms, a spare pair of reading glasses he'd needed for 2 years and never admitted to needing until recently, and a folded photograph of Noah that he'd put there by accident one morning and never taken out. He drove with the radio off. He usually did on the way to inspections. There was a kind of settling in that happened when he drove in silence, a mental gear shift from the version of himself that burned mac and cheese and argued with his son about the Flash, to the version that crawled under multi-million-dollar aircraft looking for things nobody else wanted to find. He'd been doing this for 7 years. Senior Aircraft Inspector, Federal Aviation Certification, Commercial and Private Rotary and Fixed Wing. Before that, he'd spent 4 years as an aerospace structural engineer at Vandermeer Aviation Systems. Before that chapter of his life closed in a way he still didn't talk about at dinner parties, mostly because he didn't go to dinner parties. He pulled into the Meridian Aviation Access Road at 7:34 p.m. The south hangar was lit up like a stadium. He smelled the money before he saw it. That sounds strange, but anyone who's spent time in private aviation knows exactly what he meant. There's a particular quality to high-end private terminal air, a mix of jet fuel, expensive leather, and the specific kind of tension that comes from very wealthy people being made to wait. The hangar doors were partially open, and even from the parking area, Liam could see the aircraft gleaming under the overhead lights. The Whitmore G7. He stopped walking for just a moment. It was a beautiful aircraft, objectively. 64 feet long, twin Pratt and Whitmore turbofan engines, range of nearly 7,000 miles, maximum passenger capacity of 14 in full luxury configuration. It was the kind of plane that private aviation magazines photographed from the outside and interior designers photographed from the inside, and neither group spent much time thinking about what held the engines to the wings. Liam did. He badged through the access door and stepped into the controlled chaos of the hangar. There were at least 30 people present, a ground crew of 6 in Meridian coveralls, 4 pilots, 2 in full uniform, 2 in the background looking at tablets, a catering team loading supplies through the aft galley door, 3 men in suits near the nose of the aircraft having a conversation that looked like it was being conducted at about 15 degrees above comfortable volume. And at the center of it all, standing near the air stairs with a phone pressed to one ear and a tablet in her opposite hand, was Ava Sinclair. She was shorter than she looked in photographs. That was the first thing Liam noticed. The second thing he noticed was that she was moving, not pacing exactly, but there was a kind of contained energy to the way she stood, the way she shifted her weight, like someone who'd made a decision and was now waiting for the world to catch up with it. She spotted him crossing the hangar floor and ended her call mid-sentence. "Mr. Carter." She extended her hand. Her grip was firm and brief. "Ava Sinclair. Thank you for coming on short notice." "It's my job." He shook her hand once. "What's the timeline?" "We need wheels up by 9. Ideally, 8:45. She was already moving alongside him toward the aircraft. "We have 8 passengers, including myself, 2 pilots, and 2 crew. The destination is Harrington Executive Airport in Connecticut. Flight time approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes. Has the aircraft been pre-flighted by the crew?" "Of course. Captain Morrow has 22 years of experience. I'll need the aircraft logs, the maintenance records from the last 90 days, and I'll need your ground crew to step back from the engines during my inspection." She slowed slightly, and for just a moment something crossed her face. Not quite irritation, but close. "Of course." The lead ground tech, a heavy-set man named Gruber who Liam had worked with twice before at different facilities, handed over the documentation binder without being asked. Gruber gave him a look that said, "I know the drill," and Liam gave him a nod that said, "I know you do." He started where he always started. Not with the engines. Everyone checked the engines first, which meant everyone convinced themselves the engines were fine. He started with the fuselage walk-around. The skin, the seams, the control surfaces, the landing gear assemblies. He moved slowly and deliberately, using his primary flashlight, crouching, standing, crouching again. The aircraft looked impeccable from the outside. It would. It was maintained by a private firm that billed $800 an hour, and every surface showed it. The paint was pristine, the access panels were flush, the tires were new. He noted all of it and moved on. At the left engine nacelle, he paused. Something in his peripheral attention, not a thought exactly, more like a physical sensation at the base of his neck, made him slow down. He'd long since stopped trying to explain that feeling to people who didn't inspect aircraft. It wasn't intuition in any mystical sense. It was pattern recognition built from 11 years of looking at things that were slightly wrong, and the specific way that wrongness registered somewhere below conscious thought before his brain could articulate what it was seeing. He crouched and angled his flashlight into the lower nacelle junction. The G7's engine mounting system used a forward thrust fitting and 2 lateral support fittings to attach the power plant to the pylon structure. Standard configuration. He'd inspected 14 aircraft with this basic architecture in the past 3 years. He positioned his mirror and looked deeper into the recess between the lower engine mount fitting and the structural rib behind it. He stayed there for a long time. Then he picked up his borescope. 11 minutes later, he was still crouched at the same position. By that point, Gruber had drifted back. Captain Morrow, a tall man with silver at his temples who carried himself with the specific ease of someone who'd flown for a very long time, had come down from the cockpit and was standing nearby with his arms loosely crossed. 2 of the suited men had stopped their conversation and were watching. Ava Sinclair had walked over and was standing 4 feet behind him. "Mr. Carter," her voice was carefully level. "Is there a problem?" He didn't answer immediately. He repositioned the borescope and looked again. Then he stood up. He turned around and looked at Ava Sinclair directly. Her expression had shifted. The careful executive composure was still there, but something had sharpened underneath it. "There's a crack in the lower engine mount fitting," he said. "Left engine. The fitting itself is at the attachment point to the structural rib." Silence. Captain Morrow unfolded his arms. "How significant?" "I can't give you the full picture without more testing, but from what I can see with the borescope, it's not a surface crack. It goes deeper." He paused. "The fitting in question is a primary load-bearing component. It transfers engine thrust loads into the wing structure. If it fails, Inspector." One of the suited men stepped forward. He was maybe 55, heavy through the shoulders, with the practiced authority of someone who ran large meetings. "Our maintenance team certified this aircraft 6 days ago. Are you telling me they missed something?" "I'm telling you what I'm looking at right now." With a flashlight and a camera on a stick, the man's voice had a particular quality. Not quite contempt, but comfortable dismissal. The tone of someone who considered his own assessment of a situation to be the only reliable data point. "We have a maintenance certification dated 6 days ago, a captain with 22 years of experience, and a flight that has to depart tonight." Liam looked at him for a moment. "What's your name?" The man blinked. People didn't usually ask him that directly. "Marcus Webb. I'm CFO of Sinclair Aerotech." "Mr. Webb, I don't care about the maintenance certification. I don't care about Captain Morrow's experience. I care about what's in that engine mount right now." He kept his voice flat and even. "And right now, what's in that engine mount concerns me enough that I can't sign off on this flight." The hangar went very quiet. "Mr. Carter?" Ava's voice was different now, quieter, more direct, stripped of the professional warmth. She was looking at him with an expression that was hard to read. "I need you to understand what's at stake tonight. The 8 people boarding this aircraft are the investors whose decision in the next 72 hours determines whether my company survives the next 5 years. This flight is not incidental. It is the meeting. If we don't get to Connecticut tonight, Ms. Sinclair." He interrupted her gently, which was not something he did often. "I understand what you're telling me." "Do you?" "Yes." He met her eyes. "And I'm still telling you that aircraft cannot fly tonight." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't fully identify. Frustration, fear, something else underneath both. Then Marcus Webb stepped closer. "There are protocols for disputed inspections. You know that. We can request a second inspector." "You can do that," Liam said. "That's your right. But until a second inspector signs off, my ruling stands. And I'll tell you right now, any qualified inspector who looks at what I'm looking at will reach the same conclusion." "You're very confident." "I'm looking at a crack in a primary engine mount fitting. I don't need a lot of confidence. I just need eyes." The next 20 minutes were the kind that exist in a specific way in Liam's memory. Not as a continuous sequence, but as a series of distinct moments, each one separate, like frames from a film. Captain Morrow asking to look through the borescope himself, and then being very quiet for about 30 seconds, and then handing it back without comment. Marcus Webb on his phone, voice low and controlled, speaking to someone Liam couldn't identify. The catering crew pausing their loading, exchanging looks. 3 of the investors gathering near the front of the aircraft, their conversation shifting into something more serious. Ava Sinclair standing apart from all of it, looking at the aircraft with an expression that was absolutely unreadable. Then she walked over to him. Not to argue. Something in her posture had changed. She stopped beside him, her arms crossed loosely, and looked at the engine nacelle. "If I offered you $100,000, she said quietly, to let this flight depart, would that change anything?" He looked at her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trying to bribe him in any crass sense. She looked, if anything, slightly desperate, the way someone looks when they've run out of conventional options and are testing the remaining ones. "No," he said. 200,000. "Ms. Sinclair, I'm asking. I'm not threatening. I'm asking." "The answer is no," he said. "Not because of what you're offering, because there is a crack in that fitting. Money doesn't change what's in that metal." She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly that answer and had needed to hear it anyway. Then Marcus Webb came back from wherever he'd gone, and he wasn't alone. Behind him was a man in a Meridian Aviation Management blazer, the facility's duty manager, a thin man named Holloway, who Liam had dealt with twice before and found to be mostly spineless under pressure. "Liam!" Holloway's voice had the strained quality of a person being pushed from multiple directions simultaneously. "I've spoken with the owner's team. They're requesting that we either produce a second inspector within the hour or formally document your finding and allow the flight to proceed under Captain's authority." Liam stared at him. "Holloway, you know that's not how this works. Under certain regulatory frameworks, under FAR, Part 91, the pilot in command has authority over flight operations. Under FAR Part 65 and my certification, I have the authority to ground an aircraft on an airworthiness finding. Those are two different things, and they don't conflict." He paused. "Unless you're telling me this facility is willing to let that aircraft depart with a documented unresolved airworthiness finding." Holloway opened and closed his mouth. "Because if you are," Liam said, and his voice was very quiet now, "I need you to put that in writing with your name on it." Silence. Nobody put anything in writing. Met. At 8:12 p.m., Liam stood at the base of the air stairs and raised his voice to be heard across the hangar floor. "I need everyone off the aircraft," he said. "All passengers, all crew, everybody out." The investors looked at each other. One of them, a gray-haired woman in a charcoal blazer, stood up from where she'd been seated just inside the cabin door and looked down at him with the particular expression of someone extremely accustomed to not being told what to do. "This is a joke," she said. "Ma'am, I need you to deplane." "Do you have any idea, I know exactly what I'm asking you to do," Liam said. "I'm asking you to get off an aircraft that I believe has a structural defect in its engine mounting. You can be angry about it if you want, but please get off the plane." She looked at him for a very long second. Then she looked at Ava Sinclair, who was standing near the nose of the aircraft with her arms at her sides. Ava gave a single, small nod. The gray-haired woman descended the air stairs. One by one, they came off. The investors, the cabin crew, the co-pilot. Captain Morrow was last, coming down the stairs with the practiced composure of a man who'd seen many things in 22 years of flying and was determined not to visibly react to this one. He stopped beside Liam at the bottom of the stairs. "You better be right," Morrow said, not threateningly, just flatly, with the weight of a man who understood exactly what the alternatives meant. "I know," Liam said. But by 8:30, the hangar had rearranged itself. The investors were gathered in a knot near the service entrance, most of them on their phones. Marcus Webb had found a corner and was conducting what appeared to be 4 simultaneous calls. The catering crew had retreated. The ground team stood near the equipment bay, uncertain what their job was now. Ava Sinclair was sitting on a metal equipment case about 20 feet from the aircraft, her tablet dark in her hands, looking at nothing. Liam was filling out his formal documentation at a folding table Gruber had set up for him. He wrote slowly and precisely. He always did. The documentation had to be specific enough to be actionable, accurate enough to hold up to review, and clear enough that someone with no background in structural engineering could read it and understand what the concern was. Left engine lower mount fitting. Forward lower attachment point. Observed discontinuity consistent with fatigue crack initiating at attachment bore, propagating approximately. "You were an engineer." He looked up. Ava was standing on the other side of the table. She hadn't approached loudly. He'd simply not heard her come over. Her voice was flat now, all the executive polish gone, replaced with something more direct. "What?" he said. Before this, she gestured vaguely at his documentation, his bag, his uniform. "Before the inspector job. You were an aerospace engineer." She paused. "The way you described the fitting to Holloway, the load path, you didn't learn that from inspection training." He looked at her steadily. "Is that a question?" "I looked you up while I was sitting over there." She held up her phone briefly. "LinkedIn is fairly thin on details for you, but the FAA certification database isn't." A pause. "Vandermeer Aviation Systems. You spent 4 years there as a structural engineer. On what program?" He set down his pen. "Miss Sinclair, please." Her voice dropped, just slightly, but enough to shift the register of the conversation entirely. "Please just tell me." He looked at her for a long moment. The hangar around them was still buzzing with activity. Phones, conversations, the distant sound of someone arguing on a call. But in their small perimeter of the folding table and the equipment case, it felt oddly separate. "The G7, he said. She stared at him. "I was part of the structural engineering team on the G7 program at Vandermeer. The original design team." He paused. "That aircraft." He nodded toward the plane. "I know every load path in it, because I helped design them." She sat down slowly on the equipment case. Not because she was weak, he had the sense she was never weak, but because she needed a moment to process what she'd just heard. "And the fitting," she said. "The one you found tonight." He nodded. "You've seen it before." "I predicted it," he said. 9 years ago, before the aircraft entered production." The silence that followed that sentence had a specific quality. It wasn't the silence of shock, exactly. Or not only that, it was the silence of something large and slow finally arriving at a place it had been traveling toward for a very long time. Ava looked at him. "What do you mean you predicted it?" He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pen and set it down again. "During the final design review," he said, "I flagged a concern about the lower engine mount fitting at the attachment bore, the geometry of the hole, the load path, the stress concentration. Under certain combinations of thrust cycling and turbulence loading, I calculated there was a non-trivial probability of fatigue crack initiation over time." He paused. "I wrote a formal engineering concern report. I requested a design modification, a reinforcement plate, and a slightly altered bore geometry that would have reduced the stress concentration significantly." "What happened to the report?" "It was reviewed." He said it simply without emphasis. "The program manager at the time, a man named Dennis Alcott, determined that the modification would add weight, add cost, and delay the certification schedule by approximately 4 months. The risk assessment was reclassified as acceptable. The design went forward unchanged." Ava's expression was very still. "And you?" "I filed a dissent in the engineering record, which I was entitled to do." A pause. "And then my contract on the program ended. Restructuring, they called it. My position was eliminated." He looked down at his documentation. "I tried to follow up through official channels. The FAA received a copy of my original concern report. It was reviewed and the program's risk assessment was accepted." He picked up his pen again. "So eventually I moved on, went back to school for my inspection certification, took the inspector route. Because you could still ground aircraft." He looked up at her. "Because as an inspector," she said slowly, "you still had the authority to stop a flight, even without a company behind you, even without a program manager overruling you." He didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't need to. Ava was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the aircraft, at the left engine, at the nacelle that housed the fitting he'd found, and her expression had something in it now that Liam couldn't quite name. Not guilt, not quite. Something more complicated. "My company acquired several of the Vandermeer G7 assets 2 years ago," she said, "including the maintenance program." A pause. "I didn't build this aircraft, but I operate it, and I was going to put 8 people on it tonight." "Yes, because I trusted the maintenance record." "I know." and you stopped it." He didn't say anything. She exhaled, a long, controlled breath that she seemed to release from somewhere deep. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I offered you $200,000 less than an hour ago to let that flight leave. I remember. And now I'm sitting here understanding that if it had—" She stopped. She looked away briefly at the cluster of investors near the service entrance, at Marcus Webb still on his phone in the corner. "I would have killed everyone on that plane." "You didn't know," he said. "That's why inspections exist." "That's a very generous way to characterize it. It's just accurate." She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of respect, or might have been something more complicated than respect. And then her phone buzzed, and the world of schedules and investors and consequences came crashing back in, and she stood up and answered it. Liam went back to his documentation. At 9:07 p.m., 22 minutes after the flight was supposed to take off, Marcus Webb came to stand in front of the folding table. "I want to be clear," Webb said, "that we reserve the right to challenge this finding through the appropriate regulatory channels." "That's your right," Liam said without looking up. "And I want it on record that this decision has caused significant damage to our company's interests and our investor relationships." "That's your right too. Is there anything—" Webb stopped, recalibrated. "Is there anything that can be done tonight to allow the flight to proceed?" Liam put down his pen and looked at him directly. "Mr. Webb, you need an engineering team with proper NDT equipment to assess the full extent of that crack. You need a structural assessment of whether the fitting is repairable in place or requires replacement. You need a review of the repair against the manufacturer's structural repair manual. And then you need me, or another certifying inspector, to sign off on the result." He held Webb's gaze. "That process takes days, minimum. Probably longer if the crack has propagated to the depth I think it has." A pause. "No. There's nothing that can be done tonight to allow this flight to proceed." Webb stood there for a moment. Then he walked away. At 9:34 p.m., the last investor's car pulled out of the Meridian Aviation parking lot. The deal, whatever shape it had taken, whatever it had meant for Sinclair Aerotech's future, was in some form of suspension that Liam didn't fully understand and wasn't his job to understand. The aircraft sat in the hangar under its lights, silent and beautiful and grounded. He finished his documentation at 9:41 p.m. It was 12 pages. He gave the signed copies to Holloway, who received them with the expression of a man who'd spent the last 2 hours hoping things would resolve themselves and was only now accepting that they hadn't. He picked up his inspection bag, checked that he had everything, found the spare reading glasses still there, and the photograph of Noah. He was walking toward the exit when he heard footsteps behind him. "Mr. Carter." He turned. Ava Sinclair was standing in the middle of the hangar floor about 15 feet from him. She looked different, somehow, than she had 3 hours ago. The same person, the same face, but something had shifted in the way she was carrying herself. Less momentum, more weight. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "I mean it." She paused. "I know what tonight cost you, professionally. Standing in that room with all those people pushing back." "It's my job," he said. "It's more than your job." She looked at him for a moment. "You could have taken the path of least resistance at about 40 different points in the last 3 hours. You didn't." He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked at her, and she looked at him, and the aircraft sat between them in the bright hangar light. "Go home to your son," she said finally. He nodded again. Then he turned and walked out into the night. He called Mrs. Delgado from the parking lot and told her he'd be home within the hour. She said Noah was fine, had eaten 2 bowls of cereal because apparently the mac and cheese had gotten cold, and he decided to start over, and was currently asleep on the couch with a book on his chest. He sat in the car for a moment before starting the engine. The crack he'd found was approximately 12 millimeters in length at its visible extent. That didn't sound like much. A fingernail was about 15 millimeters, half an inch, the kind of thing you'd walk past 100 times without seeing. But a crack in a primary load-bearing fitting didn't follow rules that made sense to people outside the engineering world. It followed stress paths, propagation rates, cycle counts. It grew invisibly, microscopically, incrementally, right up until the moment it didn't. He started the car and pulled out of the lot. 40 minutes later, he was home. Noah was asleep on the couch, exactly as Mrs. Delgado had described. His chin tilted up, his mouth slightly open, a book about deep-sea creatures resting face down on his chest. Liam covered him with the blanket from the armchair, turned off the lamp, and stood in the dark living room for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen, found the dishes from earlier, and washed them. He didn't think about Ava Sinclair. He didn't think about the investors, or Marcus Webb, or the deal that had collapsed somewhere in the gap between 8:45 p.m. and whenever those cars left the parking lot. He thought about the fitting, about the bore geometry, about the stress concentration factor he had calculated 9 years ago on a computer at a desk in a building that no longer existed in the form he remembered it. He had been right. He had been right then, and no one had listened, and he had paid for that in ways that still left marks on his professional record and his sense of himself that weren't entirely healed. And tonight, he had been right again, and this time, the people on that aircraft had walked away. He dried the last dish, set it in the cabinet, and turned off the kitchen light. Somewhere on the tarmac at Meridian Aviation, a $40 million aircraft sat grounded and silent, its left engine nacelle housing a crack so small you almost had to know where to look. Almost. The news broke by morning. Not the full story. Not yet. Just the surface of it, the part that fit neatly into a single headline. Sinclair Aerotech investor. Flight grounded at Meridian Aviation. Following airworthiness concern. 12 words that told you almost nothing and implied everything. By 7 a.m., it was running on 3 financial news feeds and 1 regional aviation blog that somehow always got these things first. By 8 a.m., Sinclair Aerotech's stock had dropped 4 points in pre-market trading, which didn't sound catastrophic until you understood that 4 points represented roughly $340 million in paper value evaporating before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Liam read about it on his phone while Noah ate cereal across the kitchen table, asking him between bites whether deep-sea fish could theoretically survive if you brought them to the surface slowly enough. It depends on the species, Liam said, not looking up. But theoretically. Some of them might. The pressure differential is the issue, not the surface environment itself. Noah considered this. So it's not the destination that kills them. It's the transition. Liam looked up from his phone at that. His son was 9 and said things like that completely without drama, the way other kids stated sports scores or TV plots. Just facts, just the way things worked. Yeah, Liam said. That's exactly right. He put his phone face down on the table and finished his coffee. He'd slept badly. Not from guilt. He'd examined that question at about 2 a.m. lying in the dark and found, honestly, that the guilt wasn't there. What was there was something more complicated. A kind of low-grade vibration in his chest that he couldn't name precisely. The feeling of a door having been opened that he'd spent a long time keeping closed. The G7 program. Vandermeer. Dennis Alcott and the concern report that had been reviewed, reclassified, and quietly buried. He hadn't thought about those things with any sustained attention in years. He'd made a deliberate choice not to, the same way you made a deliberate choice not to press on a bruise that had mostly healed. Last night had pressed on it. He dropped Noah at school at 7:52, watched him disappear through the front doors with his backpack hanging off one shoulder, at the specific angle that meant he was thinking about something and hadn't noticed the strap slipping, and then sat in the pickup lane for a moment longer than he needed to before pulling out into traffic. His phone rang at 8:14. Unknown number with a Connecticut area code. Carter, he answered. Mr. Carter, this is Richard Hale. I'm General Counsel for Sinclair Aerotech. The voice was measured and professional. I'm calling to inform you that our engineering team will be arriving at Meridian Aviation this morning to conduct an independent assessment of the airworthiness finding you submitted last night. We wanted to make you aware and to ask whether you'd be available to speak with our lead engineer regarding the specifics of your observation. I'm available, Liam said. My documentation is complete and on file with Meridian. Everything I found is in there. Of course. Nevertheless, our engineer, Dr. Patricia Osei, Would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you directly. She's flying in from our Hartford facility. Liam recognized the name. Patricia Osei had published 3 papers on fatigue crack propagation in aluminum alloy structures that he'd read during his certification study years ago. She was serious. Good. Tell Dr. Osei I'll be at Meridian at 11, he said. He hung up and drove. He stopped at a gas station, filled the tank, stood in the cold morning air, and looked at nothing in particular while the pump ran. A truck pulled in beside him. Country music leaked out the cracked window. The driver, a heavy-set man in a feed company hat, nodded at him without making eye contact. The particular acknowledgement of 2 men who'd both chosen to exist in the same space without needing to discuss it. Liam thought about Patricia Osei's papers, about the crack, about the 12 millimeters he'd measured with his borescope in the angle of the lower mount fitting. 12 millimeters was what he'd seen. What he hadn't seen, what no borescope in the world could tell him without cutting the fitting open, was how far it went. He thought about what Captain Morrow had looked like, standing at the bottom of those air stairs with his 22 years of experience and his precise, careful face, saying, "You better be right." The pump clicked off. He replaced the nozzle, got back in the car, and drove toward Meridian. He was 40 minutes early. He sat in the parking lot and read the rest of the financial news on his phone, not because he cared about Sinclair Aerotech's stock price, but because understanding the full pressure Ava Sinclair was under helped him understand the shape of the conversations that were going to happen today. The investor group, a consortium he now read were called Hartwell Capital Partners, had apparently issued a statement through their own PR firm expressing confidence in Sinclair Aerotech's leadership while simultaneously rescheduling the Connecticut meeting to a video conference, which was, in the language of high finance, the equivalent of a very polite slap. He put the phone away when he saw the first unfamiliar car pull into the lot. Dr. Patricia Osei was not what he'd expected, which was his fault for having expectations. She was perhaps 45, compact and precise in her movements, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she kept forgetting were there and reaching up to look for them on her face. She had a team of 3 with her, 2 younger engineers and a technician carrying a hard case of NDT equipment, and she shook Liam's hand with the focused efficiency of someone who wanted to skip pleasantries and was doing them anyway out of professional courtesy. "Mr. Carter, I've read your documentation." "Dr. Osei." "Walk me to the aircraft." Not a question. He walked her to the aircraft. She crouched at the left engine nacelle in almost the exact position he'd been in the night before, and he handed her his borescope without being asked because it was faster than waiting for her team to unpack theirs. She looked for a long time, longer than he had even. One of her engineers crouched beside her, and she pointed at something on the scope's small screen, and he nodded, and she said something low that Liam couldn't hear. Then she stood up. "The bore," she said. "Yes." "How long were you looking at it before you called it?" "About 11 minutes before I was certain. Another 5 before I spoke to anyone." "But..." She nodded, turned to her technician, and said, "Set up the phased array. Full bore geometry scan, lower fitting, both attachment points." The technician opened the hard case. Liam stepped back and let them work. He found a metal stool near the equipment wall and sat on it with his documentation binder on his knees, making notes in the margins. Additional observations he'd had overnight. Reference points for the G7 structural repair manual. The stress concentration calculations he'd first run 9 years ago and had rerun in his head at 2 a.m. and gotten the same answer. Holloway appeared at 11:45, looking slightly better rested than he had the night before, but still carrying the expression of a man who'd spent significant time on the phone explaining things to people who outranked him. He didn't say anything to Liam directly. He went to speak with Dr. Osei's team, looked at the NDT equipment, nodded at something one of the engineers told him, and then retreated to his office. Marcus Webb arrived at noon in a black car he hadn't driven himself. He was in a different suit than last night, charcoal instead of navy, but his expression was the same. He went directly to Osei's team, was redirected by the younger engineer, and then came to stand near Liam's stool. "Good morning," Webb said. "Mr. Webb, I won't pretend last night ended well. No. But I will say..." Webb paused, recalibrating, which he seemed to do frequently. I spoke with our legal team this morning. There are questions about the scope of your finding, whether the documentation accurately reflects Mr. Webb. Liam set his binder down on his knees. You have one of the best fatigue crack analysts in the country standing 30 feet away scanning that fitting right now. Whatever questions you have about the scope of my finding, she'll answer them for you. He picked up the binder again. I'd wait for her report. Webb looked at him for a moment. A different look than last night. Less dismissive. Something more calibrated in it. You said last night that you predicted this, Webb said quietly. The crack. Liam went still. Ava told me, Webb said. This morning. She told me you were on the G7 design team at Vandermeer. He paused. Is that true? It's in my certification record. It's not a secret. And you filed a concern report? Yes. About this specific fitting? About the bore geometry at the lower engine mount attachment point? Yes. Webb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the aircraft. He had the expression of a man doing rapid, complex arithmetic in his head. Not the engineering kind, but the liability kind, which was its own complicated math. How long ago? He said carefully. 9 years and 4 months. Another silence. And the concern report is in the Vandermeer Engineering Archive, which Sinclair Aerotech acquired when you purchased the G7 program assets. Liam looked at him directly. So yes, Mr. Webb, it exists. And yes, it's probably in your own files somewhere. Webb's face didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. The expression of a man who had just understood something that made his morning considerably worse. Excuse me, Webb said. He took out his phone and walked toward the far corner of the hangar. Liam went back to his notes. At 1:17 p.m., Patricia Osei called him over. She was standing at a folding table that her team had set up, a laptop open showing the phased array scan results, color-coded cross-sections of the fitting in false-color NDT imaging, the kind of imagery that looks like abstract art until you know what you're looking at. Then it looks like something else entirely. Come look at this, she said. He looked. The crack extended 17 millimeters from the bore, not 12. 17. It had propagated deeper than his bore scope had shown, running along a grain boundary in the aluminum alloy at an angle that the bore scope's line of sight hadn't fully captured. The scan showed the full geometry, a primary crack, and branching from it at roughly 40 degrees, a secondary propagation that had begun working its way toward the outer surface of the fitting. The room, which had been moderately busy, felt very quiet. 17 millimeters, Osei said. Primary crack, secondary branch of approximately 9 millimeters propagating toward the outer surface. She tapped the screen. This fitting has approximately, and I want to be clear, this is a preliminary estimate pending full structural analysis, between 150 and 300 flight cycles remaining before the probability of catastrophic failure exceeds acceptable thresholds. Nobody said anything for a moment. One of the younger engineers was very carefully not looking at anyone. The flight last night, Liam said, Connecticut and back. Would have been approximately 1 cycle, Osei said. Yes. She said it simply, without drama, the way engineers say things that are factual and terrible. Liam appreciated that about her. So the aircraft could have made it, Webb said, from somewhere behind them. Liam hadn't heard him return. It might have made it, Osei said, turning to look at Webb with the calm expression of someone who is very tired of that particular interpretation being the takeaway. The probability of failure on a single flight, given current crack geometry and estimated load conditions, is perhaps 5 to 8%. Those are not good odds for a commercial flight. They are catastrophic odds for a human life. I understand, Mr. Webb. Her voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now. If this fitting had failed at cruise altitude, the engine would have separated from the wing. At that point, you are not looking at an emergency landing. You are looking at structural failure of the wing itself under asymmetric loading, followed by loss of control. Everyone on that aircraft dies. She paused. That is what we are discussing, not a 5% chance of an inconvenience, a 5% chance of killing 11 people. The hangar was very quiet.
Liam looked at his hands. He was thinking, not for the first time, and with a clarity that always surprised him when it arrived, about the difference between a number and a fact. 5 to 8%. That was a number. That was a calculation. The fact was Ava Sinclair and 7 other people and 2 pilots walking down those air stairs last night into the cold hangar air, alive, irritated, their phones buzzing with messages about a collapsed deal, their future uncertain. Alive. The fact was that alive and uncertain was the only version of this story that had a next chapter. He became aware that someone was standing in the hangar entrance. He looked up. Ava Sinclair was standing just inside the large door, still in her coat, a travel bag over one shoulder. She must have come directly from somewhere. Her hair was slightly wind-caught, and she had the focused, slightly compressed look of a person who'd been moving fast for hours and had just stopped. She looked at the laptop screen from across the room. She couldn't read the scan data from that distance. But she could read the room. She walked toward them. Osei met her halfway and spoke to her in a low voice, turning the laptop so she could see the screen. Liam watched Ava look at the image, watched her face do several things in rapid succession that she probably didn't know were visible. A fractional tightening around her eyes, a pause in her breathing, something that went through her jaw and then was gone. Then she straightened and her face went back to the controlled version. "Patricia," she said, "what do we need?" "The fitting needs to be replaced, not repaired. Replaced. I'll need to pull the full inspection records for every G7 in the fleet and cross-reference with cycle counts and maintenance history. Given what I'm seeing here, I don't want to assume this is an isolated case." Ava nodded. She was doing the calculations. Liam could see it. The fleet. The inspections. The cost. The time. What it meant for the company's operations, the insurance, the regulatory conversations that would begin approximately as soon as Osei's report was filed. "Do it," Ava said. "I'll need full access to your maintenance records." "You'll have everything." Ava looked at Webb. "Make sure she has everything." Webb nodded. He had the expression of a man who had accepted that his morning had been irreparably bad and was now focused on containing the afternoon. Ava looked at Liam then. He was still sitting on his stool near the equipment wall. She walked over to him and he stood because it seemed like the right thing to do, though he wasn't sure why. "Dr. Osei confirmed what you found," she said. It wasn't a question. "And then some," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The composed version of her face, the CEO face, was still there, but he'd seen enough of her last night to know it was a surface now, not the whole thing. 17 millimeters, she said quietly. I heard her say that. "Yes." "You found a 12-millimeter crack with a flashlight and a borescope." "And prior knowledge of where to look," he said. "Because you designed it." "Because I worried about it," he corrected. "For 9 years." She absorbed that. She looked away toward the aircraft and then back. "Your concern report from Vandermeer. It exists." "I know. I had our archivist pull it this morning." She paused. "It's 47 pages. Your analysis, the load calculations, the proposed modification." Another pause, longer. "It's the most thorough engineering document I've read in a long time." He didn't say anything. "They buried it," she said. "They reclassified the risk as acceptable." He said it without bitterness. He'd had 9 years to work through the bitterness. That's different from burying it. Is it? He thought about that honestly. Maybe not. No. She crossed her arms, looked at the floor for a moment. "Dennis Alcott," she said. Liam looked at her sharply. She'd done more research this morning than he'd given her credit for. "He's been with 3 companies since Vandermeer," she said. "Currently SVP of Operations at Hartwell Capital Partners." The name landed strangely. Hartwell Capital Partners. The investor consortium. The group that had been on the aircraft last night. The group whose participation in whatever deal Ava was building had driven the entire pressure of the evening. "I didn't know that," Liam said. "I didn't either," Ava said. "Until about an hour ago." A pause. "He was going to be on that flight." Liam was very still. "He's the representative Hartwell sent for the site visit," she said. "He was one of the 8 passengers." She looked at Liam steadily. "He was going to board an aircraft to evaluate my company's facilities, not knowing, or possibly knowing perfectly well and choosing not to mention,
that he had once signed the documentation suppressing the concern report that identified the crack that was about to kill him. The hangar around them continued its ordinary business. Osei's team continued setting up equipment. Somewhere a phone rang and someone answered it. The machinery of a regular working day proceeding in parallel with something that was anything but. "Do you know if he knew?" Liam asked. "No," she said. "I don't know. And I'm not sure it matters right now. It might matter eventually." "Yes." She looked at him. "It might." She left him then to go deal with the 15 other things that were pulling at her, and he sat back down on his stool and looked at his hands again for a moment before picking up his documentation binder. Dennis Alcott. He rolled the name over in his mind. He hadn't thought about that name in a concentrated way in years. Dennis Alcott had been 52 when Liam was 23, a program manager with a particular gift for making financial decisions sound like engineering decisions, and vice versa. He'd had a way of listening to technical arguments with complete apparent attention and then dismissing them in language that sounded technically informed, but was, underneath the vocabulary, purely economic. The stress concentration analysis is within acceptable parameters when balanced against production timeline requirements. Translation: we're not fixing it because fixing it costs money and time. Liam's contract had ended 6 weeks after he'd filed the formal dissent. He'd never been able to prove those two things were connected. Restructuring was restructuring. Projects ended, contracts expired, people moved on. The engineering world was full of people who had once worked on programs that had stopped needing them. He'd moved on. He told himself he'd moved on. He thought about Noah asking whether it was the destination or the transition that killed the deep-sea fish. The kid had no idea what he'd landed on. At 2:30, Osei found him still at the equipment wall and sat down on a folding chair across from him with a cup of coffee that someone had apparently produced from somewhere in the facility. She looked at him with the direct, uncalculating expression of a scientist who had decided to speak plainly. "Your original concern report," she said. "I had it pulled from the archive this morning. Ava authorized access. I heard. I read the load analysis." She paused. "It was correct." He nodded. "The stress concentration factor at the bore geometry, the fatigue life estimation under mixed mode loading. Your methodology was sound. Your conclusions were sound." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "If the modification you proposed had been implemented, it's probable this crack never initiates, or initiates decades later, well within maintenance detection intervals." "I know," he said. And then, because it was true, and he might as well say it, "I've known that for 9 years. She looked at him with the particular compassion of someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be right about something for a very long time, in a context where being right didn't help you. "What happened to your career," she said, "after you left Vandermeer?" "I went back to school, got my inspection certification, applied to the FAA for a designee authorization, took inspection positions with 3 different MRO facilities before Meridian." He said it plainly, like reading from a resume, because that was the cleanest way to do it. "That's a significant step down from senior structural engineer," she said. "Yes." "You made that choice deliberately." "I made the choice I could make." He paused. "As an engineer, I could flag concerns and be overruled. As an inspector with FAA certification, I could ground aircraft on an airworthiness finding, and the aircraft stayed grounded. It wasn't the same authority, but it was authority nobody could reclassify." She was quiet for a moment. "The crack you found last night," she said. "Under what circumstances would a standard pre-flight inspection have caught it?" "It wouldn't have," he said. "Not without specific direction to look at that fitting, in that position, with bore scope access. The visual angle from a standard walk-around doesn't reach the bore. So only someone who knew specifically where to look would have found it, yes." She nodded slowly. "Then last night wasn't really about inspection skill. It was about knowing where to look," he said, "which is the same thing as knowing where the design was worried." She looked at her coffee. "I'm going to include your original concern report in my assessment filing," she said, "as technical background, with your permission." He thought about it for a moment. Not long. Yes, he said. That's fine. She nodded and stood up and was about to go back to her team when she paused. Mr. Carter, for what it's worth, what you did last night and what you did 9 years ago, those aren't separate stories. They're the same one. He looked at her. Last night you stopped the consequence, she said. 9 years ago you identified the cause. That's the whole arc. She picked up her coffee. Most engineers only get one half or the other. He didn't have an answer for that. She walked back to her team. He sat with it. The afternoon continued around him. Osei's team worked. Webb made calls. Holloway came in and out of his office. At some point, someone brought sandwiches and left them on a folding table near the aircraft, and Liam ate half of one without particularly tasting it. At 4:15, his phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. This is Marcus Webb. I need 5 minutes. Away from the hangar, the coffee cart on the east side of the building. MW. He looked at it for a moment, then put his phone in his pocket and went to find the coffee cart. Webb was already there, standing with a paper cup he wasn't drinking. He'd loosened his tie, which was the most disheveled Liam had seen him. He looked like a man who had spent the day being told things he didn't want to know and was now deciding how to metabolize them. I want to ask you something directly, Webb said, and I'd like a direct answer. Okay. When you walked into that hangar last night, before you started the inspection, did you already suspect what you'd find? Liam considered the question honestly. No. I didn't know the aircraft was a G7 until I saw it. I don't choose my inspections. But once I saw it, I knew what the potential vulnerabilities were. Yes, he paused. That's not the same as going in looking for something specific. I didn't want to find a crack. I was hoping not to find one. Webb nodded. He looked at his coffee. The concern report, he said. Ava is going to pursue the question of what Alcott knew and when. That's her decision. Yes. Webb looked at him directly. I want you to know, and I recognize I have no particular right to ask for this, but I want you to know that not everyone at this company knew what was in those archive files. Ava didn't know. I didn't know. When we acquired the G7 assets, we inherited a maintenance program and a documentation system that was... He stopped. That was not well organized. That's not an excuse. It's context. Mr. Webb, Liam said, I'm not holding Sinclair Aerotech responsible for what Vandermeer did 9 years ago. Webb blinked. That had apparently not been the response he was prepared for. I'm holding a structural fitting responsible for developing a fatigue crack, Liam continued, which it did, on schedule, exactly as the stress analysis predicted it would. That's not anyone's fault at this company. That's physics. He paused. The question going forward is what you do with the information you now have. That part is your choice. Webb was quiet for a long moment. You're a strange man, he said finally. Not unkindly. I've been told. Webb looked away at the building's eastern wall, at nothing particular. Patricia Osei is filing her preliminary report tonight. She's recommending mandatory inspection of all G7 variants in Sinclair's fleet. She's also recommending we notify the FAA's Aircraft Certification Office and the type certificate holder. He paused. There are 4 other operators with G7 aircraft in the U.S. and 14 internationally. Liam felt the number settle on him. 18 aircraft. 18 aircraft with the same bore geometry, the same stress concentration, the same fatigue crack initiation site. 18 aircraft that had been flying for the same number of years, accumulating the same cycles, developing the same invisible progression of damage in a fitting that no standard inspection protocol directed anyone to look at closely enough. How quickly can you get the FAA involved? He asked. Osei is making the call tonight. We're not waiting. Webb looked back at him. I want you to know that. Whatever else you think of how this company operates, we are not waiting. Liam believed him. He wasn't sure why exactly. Webb was a CFO, a financial animal, a man whose instincts ran toward calculated risk. But there was something in the way he said it, flat and without rhetorical flourish, that had the texture of a decision already made. Good, Liam said. He drove home at 6:40. The evening was cold, the sky a flat gray that turned pink at the edges near the horizon before fading altogether. He drove with the radio off again. He was thinking about 18 aircraft, about the passengers who would board those aircraft tomorrow and the next day and the next, people who had no idea that a crack was growing somewhere in the metal that held their engine to their wing. People who had no reason to know, people who were trusting, reasonably, rationally trusting. The invisible infrastructure of expertise and caution and regulatory oversight that was supposed to catch exactly this thing before it caught them. He thought about the oversight that had failed 9 years ago, about the document that had been correctly filed, correctly reviewed, and incorrectly dismissed, about the particular way that institutional pressure could reframe a technical certainty as a manageable risk, and the way that reframing could travel forward through time until it materialized as a 17-millimeter crack in a load-bearing fitting on a Tuesday night. He thought about Dennis Alcott boarding a car in Connecticut at some point this morning instead of a private jet, checking his phone, seeing the headlines about the grounded flight, and feeling, what? Liam didn't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe Alcott had long since stopped thinking about a concern report from a junior engineer on a program that was a decade and a half behind him. Maybe Alcott was very carefully feeling exactly nothing. He picked Noah up from Mrs. Delgado's at 7:10. Noah had apparently spent the afternoon building a cardboard model of something architectural. Mrs. Delgado described it as a bridge. Noah described it as a support structure, and they'd spent 15 minutes apparently arguing the distinction with genuine investment on both sides. In the car, Noah held the model on his lap with both hands. "The trick is the joints," Noah said, studying it. "If you get the joints wrong, the whole thing looks like it holds, but it doesn't actually." "Where'd you learn that?" Liam asked. "I figured it out. I made 2 that fell down first." Liam drove. The highway passed. Noah examined his cardboard joints with the concentrated attention of someone who had made something and was trying to understand why it worked. "Dad," Noah said after a while. "Was the work important?" Liam was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It was." "Did you fix it?" "I found it," Liam said. Finding it was the part I needed to do. Noah seemed to accept that as a complete answer. He went back to examining his model. Liam watched the road. Somewhere at Meridian Aviation, a $40 million aircraft sat in a brightly lit hangar while an engineering team prepared a report that would go to the FAA by morning. In offices in Connecticut, in hangar facilities in 4 other states, in maintenance programs across 14 international operators, the same hidden geometry existed in the same position in the same fitting on the same aircraft type. Waiting. As it had been waiting, patiently and without drama, for 9 years and 4 months. The difference now was that someone had finally said where to look. Patricia Osei filed her preliminary report at 11:47 p.m. that night. Liam knew this because she sent him a copy at 11:52 with a 2-line message that said, "Your original concern report is cited as Appendix C. I thought you should have this before morning." He read the report at his kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the kind of exhausted focus that comes from running on 4 hours of sleep and 3 days of compressed emotional weight. The report was 31 pages, dense with NDT data, crack propagation modeling, structural load analysis, and conservative but clearly stated risk conclusions. Osei wrote the way she spoke, precisely, without decoration, without hedging where hedging wasn't warranted. The last section was titled Historical Engineering Context, and it was 4 paragraphs long. It referenced the Vandermeer Concern Report by document number, summarized its methodology and conclusions, noted that the findings of the current inspection were consistent with the crack initiation mechanism identified in the original analysis, and stated plainly that the proposed design modification in the concern report, if implemented at the time of original manufacture, would, in the assessment of the current engineering team, have prevented or significantly delayed the observed crack initiation. He read that section 3 times. Then he closed the report, washed his coffee cup, and went to bed. He didn't sleep well. He didn't sleep badly. He lay in the middle distance between them and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular, which was sometimes the mind's way of thinking about everything at once without being willing to look at any of it directly. By morning, the report had reached the FAA. He knew this not because anyone called him, though they would, but because by 7:15 a.m. the financial news feeds were running a different kind of headline, not the short surface version from the day before, something longer, something that had the quality of a story that had taken a night to fully assemble itself. Aviation Authority launches. Emergency Airworthiness Review. Following Sinclair. Aerotech. Inspection Finding. 18 Whitmore G7. Aircraft potentially affected. 18 aircraft. The number was in the headline now. Noah read it over his shoulder. Not the whole thing. Noah was 9 and financial news wasn't his primary interest. But he read the headline and he said, "Is that the thing from Tuesday night?" "Yes," Liam said. 18 planes, Noah said. "That's a lot." "Yes." "How many people fly in 18 planes?" Liam looked at his son. "A lot," he said again. Noah looked at the headline for another moment, then went back to his cereal with the ease of a child who had filed the information correctly and moved on. Liam watched him for a second, the particular comfort of watching someone you love do something completely ordinary. And then he picked up his phone and saw that he had 4 missed calls, all from numbers he didn't recognize, 2 of them with FAA area codes. He started returning calls. The next 6 days were the kind that accumulate in memory, not as a sequence, but as a texture, a dense, continuous pressure of phone calls, formal interviews, documentation reviews, and the particular bureaucratic intensity of a regulatory investigation moving faster than regulatory investigations usually moved. The FAA's Aircraft Certification Office opened a formal airworthiness review within 24 hours of OSA's report. By the end of the second day, an emergency airworthiness directive was issued requiring inspection of the lower engine mount fitting on all Whitmore G7 aircraft before further flight operations. 18 aircraft were grounded globally. Liam was interviewed formally by 2 FAA investigators on the third day. A methodical woman named Chen, who had the patient, organized energy of someone who had done this specific job for a long time, and a younger man named Baxter who took notes and asked follow-up questions that were better than his apparent age suggested they'd be. They met in a conference room at the regional FSDO office, a fluorescent-lit room with a water stain on the ceiling tile above the table and a view of a parking structure through the window. Chen had read everything. His documentation from Tuesday night, his formal inspector report, his original concern report from 9 years ago, which was now Appendix C of something that had been read by people at the FAA who didn't usually read appendices. "Walk me through the inspection," she said, "from the moment you arrived." He walked her through it. She asked questions at specific points. His decision to start with the fuselage walk-around rather than the engines, the angle of his borescope placement, the lighting conditions in the nacelle recess, the basis for his judgment that the discontinuity he observed warranted the grounding order rather than a deferred maintenance notation. He answered each question with the same careful specificity he'd used in the original documentation. He didn't elaborate beyond what was asked. He didn't editorialize. When he described issuing the grounding order, Chen made a note, and Baxter looked up from his pad. At that point, Chen said, "Were you experiencing significant pressure from the aircraft operator and their team to allow the flight to proceed?" "Yes." "Could you characterize the nature of that pressure?" "Financial, reputational. A financial offer was made." He paused. 2 separate amounts. I declined both times." Baxter wrote something. "Did you at any point consider deferring the finding?" Chen asked. "No." "Why not?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because a deferred finding on a primary load-bearing engine mount fitting isn't a deferred finding. It's a decision to fly an aircraft that might not be airworthy. I don't have the authority to make that decision, and I didn't want it. Chen looked at him steadily. She had a way of pausing before her next question that felt like she was testing the weight of the previous answer against something internal. "Mr. Carter," she said, "your original concern report from Vandermeer Aviation Systems. In the 9 years since you filed it and left the company, did you ever make additional attempts to bring the concern to the attention of aviation authorities?" "Yes," he said. "Once. Approximately 18 months after leaving Vandermeer. I submitted a safety concern through the FAA's voluntary reporting system. I referenced the concern report by document number and summarized the technical findings. He paused. I received a response indicating that the matter had been reviewed in conjunction with the original type certification process, and the risk assessment was consistent with acceptable parameters. Baxter stopped writing for a moment. That response is in our system, Chen said carefully. I've seen it. I know. And after that response, I stopped. He said it without emphasis.
I'd done what I could do within the system that existed. The system made its decision. I made mine, which was to stay close to aircraft and keep looking. Chen was quiet for a moment. She looked at her notes. She had the expression of someone who was managing a fairly complicated reaction to something and choosing not to let it interfere with the interview. Thank you, Mr. Carter, she said. We'll be in touch. He drove home through the kind of gray afternoon that felt like the sky had simply given up trying. He stopped at a grocery store and bought things they needed: milk, bread, the specific brand of peanut butter that Noah considered non-negotiable, and stood in the cereal aisle for 3 minutes, unable to remember what he'd come to that section for. He bought the cereal he thought Noah had mentioned and turned out to be wrong later, and Noah ate it anyway without complaint, which was its own small kindness. On the 4th day, the first results came back from the fleet inspections. Osei called him at 8:40 a.m. She was in Hartford, had been there since the day after the initial finding, coordinating the inspection effort across Sinclair's operational fleet. Her voice on the phone had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they'd known was coming and had been dreading anyway. We found 3 more, she said. He sat down. He was in his car in the parking lot of a coffee shop, had just gotten out and was about to go in. He sat back down. 3 more aircraft with crack indications at the lower mount fitting, she said. 2 of ours, one from a European operator who volunteered their aircraft for early inspection. The European aircraft has a primary crack of approximately 8 millimeters, earliest stage, likely caught years before it would have reached critical dimensions. The 2 from our fleet, she paused. One is comparable to the Meridian aircraft, 14 millimeters, similar propagation angle. The other is worse. How much worse? 22 millimeters primary crack with significant secondary branching. That aircraft has been operating on a heavy charter schedule, high cycle count. Another pause. Patricia, our lead inspector on that one, says the fitting is within 50 to 100 cycles of probable failure. The coffee shop's front door opened and a woman came out with 2 cups, laughing at something on her phone, the ordinary world proceeding. Which operator? He asked. Crest Air Charter, based in Atlanta. They run 8 to 10 flights a week. How many passengers per flight? Typical configuration is 12. They run it nearly full most of the time. He did the math he didn't want to do. 50 to 100 cycles. 8 to 10 flights a week. 12 passengers per flight. The arithmetic of what hadn't happened yet, but had been moving steadily toward happening. Toward the moment when a fitting exceeded its remaining structural capacity, transferred a load it could no longer carry, and a turbofan engine separated from a wing at cruise altitude over some unremarkable geography. Is Crest Air grounded? He asked. Grounded the moment we found it, 3 hours ago. Her voice had the compressed quality of someone managing too much information in too small a frame. The FAA's airworthiness directive covers them. They were in the queue for inspection. We just moved them to the front. Good. Liam. She used his first name for the first time. If we hadn't found the Meridian aircraft when we did, if you hadn't grounded that flight, there's a reasonable probability that the Crest Air aircraft would have been operating for another several weeks before the next scheduled heavy maintenance, during which time, I know, he said. I wanted to say it out loud anyway. I know, he said again. Thank you. He sat in the parking lot for another few minutes after she hung up. He thought about 50 cycles. He thought about the woman who'd just come out of the coffee shop still laughing at her phone. He thought about all the people who boarded aircraft with complete reasonable confidence that someone, somewhere, in the invisible machinery of certification and inspection and regulatory oversight had done the job correctly. Most of the time they had. Most of the time was not the same as all of the time. And the gap between most and all was where people like him were supposed to live. He went in and got his coffee.
On the fifth day, Dennis Alcott called. Liam was in the middle of writing a supplemental observation report that Osei's team had requested, additional technical context from his original engineering analysis, specific load calculations, the original stress concentration modeling, when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize and a Connecticut area code. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Mr. Carter." The voice was older than he remembered, a little rougher at the edges, but the cadence was unmistakable. The practiced authority, the forward lean of someone accustomed to controlling the opening of a conversation. "This is Dennis Alcott." Liam set down his pen. "I'm sure you know who I am," Alcott said. "Yes. I've been following the developments this week." A pause. "I wanted to reach out personally." Liam didn't say anything. He waited. "I want you to know," Alcott said, "that the decision made on your concern report at Vandermeer was made in good faith, based on the risk assessment information available at the time." "Mr. Alcott," Liam said. Silence. "Why are you calling me?" A longer pause. "I told you. To reach out personally. Mr. Alcott." He kept his voice even. Not hostile, just flat and very clear. "You don't call someone to reach out personally when you have a PR department and a legal team. You call them because you want something, so I'd appreciate it if you told me what that is." The silence this time had a different quality. The rehearsed version of the conversation had apparently ended. "There's going to be an investigation," Alcott said. His voice had changed. The authority still there, but something underneath it now, something tighter. "Into the decision-making process at Vandermeer, the concern report, the risk reclassification." "I assumed there would be." "My name is on the reclassification documentation." "I know. I want you to understand that I had 17 engineers providing input on that risk assessment. Your analysis was one of many." "Mr. Alcott." He stopped him again, gently but firmly, the way you stop a car that's drifting toward something. "You had one engineer who identified the specific failure mechanism, calculated the stress concentration factor, proposed a modification that would have prevented the crack from initiating, and told you in writing that the design as approved carried a non-trivial long-term risk. That engineer was me." He paused. "The other 16 engineers were assessing different components. I was the one looking at that fitting." Silence. "And now," Liam continued, "there are 4 aircraft with cracks in that fitting, one of which was approximately 50 flight cycles from catastrophic failure, and you were scheduled to be a passenger on the first one we found." He let that sit. "So I think we can dispense with the one of many inputs framing." For a long moment, Alcott said nothing. And in that silence, Liam heard something he hadn't expected. Not defensiveness, not the advanced positioning of a man protecting his legal exposure, but something quieter and less managed. Something that might have been, if he was reading it correctly, the sound of a man sitting with something he'd been not sitting with for a very long time. "I was on the passenger manifest," Alcott said quietly, "for the Meridian flight." "I know. I didn't know about the crack. I believe that. But I knew about your report." His voice was lower now, stripped of the professional register. "I knew it existed. I knew what it said. And I signed the reclassification documentation." A pause. "I've been at this long enough to know that those decisions always feel defensible in the room where you make them. The production timeline, the cost, the risk assessment says acceptable. You move on." A pause longer than the others. "And then you're sitting in the back of a car at 6 in the morning, reading about an emergency airworthiness directive and realizing you were going to board that plane." Liam said nothing. "I'm not calling to ask you not to cooperate with the investigation," Alcott said. "I'm not calling to make a deal. I don't know exactly why I'm calling." A pause. "Maybe because you were 23 years old and I signed a document that ended your career and you were right and I was—" He stopped. "I was not right." Liam looked out the window of his apartment at the parking lot below. A woman was loading grocery bags into the back of a minivan. A kid on a bicycle was navigating the speed bumps with extreme concentration, the ordinary afternoon doing what it always did. "Mr. Alcott," he said finally, "I appreciate the call. I'll cooperate fully with the investigation because it's the right thing to do and because the investigation needs the complete picture to function correctly. That's independent of this conversation." He paused. "If you want to tell the investigators what you just told me, that's your decision, but you should tell them." A long silence. "Yes," Alcott said. "I know." The call ended. Liam sat for a minute. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the supplemental report. He wasn't angry. He'd examined that question the same way he'd examined the guilt question earlier in the week and found the same answer. Not the expected emotion, but something more complicated and less clean. Alcott was not a monster. He'd been a program manager with financial pressures and a risk assessment committee, and 17 engineers and a certification schedule, and a production cost structure that made the modification look like a problem, and Liam's concern report look like one data point among many. He'd made the decision that most people in his position would have made. That didn't make it right. It made it explicable, which was different, and considerably less satisfying than either condemnation or forgiveness. The investigation would sort out what it would sort out. That wasn't Liam's jurisdiction. On the 6th day, the story went national. He was making Noah's lunch when his phone began producing the particular rapid-fire buzzing that meant multiple messages arriving in close sequence. He finished making the sandwich, turkey, mustard, no tomato because Noah had developed a recent and firm anti-tomato position that Liam had decided wasn't worth fighting, and then looked at his phone. 3 texts from his sister in Oregon, who wanted to know if the inspector in the news was him. 2 from former colleagues, 1 from an old engineering school friend he hadn't spoken to in 4 years, and a voicemail from a number identified as belonging to the National Aviation Safety Press Association, whatever that was, requesting an interview. He texted his sister back, "Yes, I'm fine. Don't worry," and deleted the voicemail. The coverage was substantial, not sensationalized in the way he'd feared. Osei had done the press briefing herself, which had been the right call, because she spoke with technical precision and complete absence of drama, and that was harder to distort than a narrative with emotional peaks. The stories focused on the fleet-wide finding, the emergency directive, the grounded aircraft. His name appeared in most of them, accurately described, without embellishment. What he hadn't expected was the other thread, the one about the concern report. Someone in the aviation press, he never found out who, though he had suspicions it might have been Baxter, the young FAA investigator who'd been better than he looked, had obtained the reference to Appendix C in Osei's report and followed it back to the Vandermeer documentation. The story that emerged was factually accurate and precisely the kind of thing that human beings found compelling. A 23-year-old engineer sees a problem, documents it correctly, gets overruled by a program manager, loses his job, spends 9 years as an aircraft inspector positioned exactly where he needs to be to find the thing he predicted, and finds it. That was the story. It was true. He couldn't argue with it being true. What he could do, and chose to do, was not talk to anyone about it. His phone buzzed at 3:30 in the afternoon with Ava Sinclair's name on the screen. "You've seen the coverage," she said when he picked up. "Yes. Are you talking to anyone?" "No." "Good." A pause. "Not because I'm asking you not to, because I think you shouldn't have to manage the media version of your own life right now." Her voice had the particular efficiency of someone conducting multiple things at once, but with an undertone of something more deliberate underneath. "The FAA is scheduling a formal review session for next week. They want you present. Chen's office called this morning. I confirmed. There will also be..." She paused. "There's going to be a hearing, congressional subcommittee, aviation safety oversight. They've been looking for a concrete case to examine the gap between the voluntary safety reporting system and regulatory action. Your concern report and the 9-year timeline is..." Another pause. "It's exactly what they've been looking for." He was quiet. "Will you testify?" she asked. "If I'm asked." "You'll be asked." He thought about that. About sitting in front of a subcommittee and explaining, in terms that non-engineers could follow, the difference between a stress concentration factor and a manufacturing defect, and why one produced a concern report that the other didn't, and what it meant that a voluntary reporting system could receive a technically sound safety concern, review it, and return a response that said acceptable parameters, while the crack continued growing undisturbed. "Yes," he said, "I'll testify." "Thank you." A pause that felt different from her professional pauses. More personal. "Liam, 4 aircraft, one of them 50 cycles from failure." "I know." "You found the first one with a flashlight and a borescope at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night." "And prior knowledge," he said. "I keep saying that." "I keep hearing you say it," she said, "and I keep thinking that it misses the point." Her voice was quieter now. "The prior knowledge was 9 years old. You carried it for 9 years. You chose work that kept you close to aircraft. You showed up when you were called, and you stood in that hangar and held the line against every person in that room who wanted you to let go of it." A pause. "That's not prior knowledge. That's something else." He didn't have a good answer for that. "How's your son?" she asked. The shift was abrupt enough that it took him a moment to follow. "He's good," Liam said. "He built a cardboard bridge this week. He's very concerned about the structural integrity of the joints." A short pause, and then something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly controlled. "That's either a coincidence or you're raising him very specifically." "Genuinely a coincidence," he said. "I'll take that as a good sign," she said. "I'll be in touch about the FAA review." She hung up. He put the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then he got up and looked in the refrigerator for something to make for dinner, found the ingredients for a reasonable pasta, and started boiling water. The formal FAA review session took place 8 days after the Meridian grounding. It was held at the FSDO regional office in a larger conference room than the interview, the kind of room designed to hold multiple stakeholders simultaneously, which it did. Chen and Baxter from the FAA investigation team, 2 additional inspectors from the Aircraft Certification Office, legal representatives for Sinclair Aerotech, a representative from the type certificate holder for the G7 airframe, Patricia Osei and her lead engineer, a representative from the National Transportation Safety Consulting Office who'd been brought in as an independent technical expert, and Liam. He sat at the table in his best work clothes, which were his only non-uniform clothes, which were a navy jacket and gray slacks he'd bought for Noah's school events. He'd ironed them carefully the night before, and Noah had watched him do it with the particular expression of a child filing away evidence. The session ran for 4.5 hours. What emerged through the systematic presentation of engineering data, inspection records, NDT results, crack propagation modeling, and the historical documentation trail from Vandermeer to the present was a picture that was both precise and deeply uncomfortable. Precise because the engineering was unambiguous, the crack initiation mechanism, the propagation rate, the remaining structural life estimates were calculable facts supported by physical evidence. Uncomfortable because the timeline was equally unambiguous. A documented safety concern had existed for 9 years, had passed through appropriate channels, and had not resulted in any modification to the design or any specific inspection directive targeting the identified risk. 4 aircraft had been found with crack indications. One had been within 50 cycles of probable catastrophic failure. The type certificate holder's representative, a careful man named Erickson who had prepared extensively and showed it, argued that the original risk assessment had been made in good faith based on the analytical tools available at the time, and that the absence of in-service cracking reports over the aircraft's operational life to that point had been consistent with the acceptable risk classification. He was technically correct in a way that the room found deeply unsatisfying. Chen asked the question that Liam had been waiting for someone to ask. "Mr. Erickson, given what we now know about the crack propagation rate and initiation mechanism, at what point in the aircraft's operational service life would the standard inspection protocol, as defined by the approved maintenance program, have been likely to detect the crack without specific direction to examine the affected location?" Erickson paused. His legal representative leaned slightly toward him and said nothing. "Based on the current finding data," Erickson said carefully, "it is probable that the crack would not have been detectable by standard inspection protocol until it had reached a size consistent with imminent failure risk." The room was very quiet. "Meaning," Chen said, "that the existing maintenance program would not have caught this before it became a safety-critical finding." "That is a possible interpretation of the data, yes." Is there another interpretation? Erickson paused again. No, he said, not a reasonable one. The session ended at 2:47 p.m. People gathered their materials, had the side conversations that follow formal proceedings, and moved gradually toward the door. The technical representative from the NTSB consulting office stopped beside Liam's chair and introduced himself, a compact man named Ortega, who had the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent a career in accident reconstruction and had learned to see backward from consequences to causes. Mr. Carter, Ortega said, I've read your original concern report. Dr. Osei has been generous in distributing it, Liam said. The load analysis is correct, Ortega said simply. I had 2 of my analysts review it independently. Your stress concentration modeling, your crack initiation prediction, your proposed modification. The methodology is sound and the conclusions hold up against current computational tools. He paused. You did this analysis at 23. I had good professors. Ortega looked at him with the measured expression of a man who had spent a career parsing what people said against what they meant. Your professors gave you the tools, he said. You're the one who looked at that board geometry and understood what it was going to do over time. That's not a teachable skill. That's something different. Liam didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. The congressional testimony, Ortega said. I'll be appearing as well. I think our accounts will complement each other. He extended his hand. It's been a long time since I've been in a room with someone who had the right answer and the patience to wait 9 years for the world to catch up with it. Liam shook his hand. He drove home through the late afternoon light. The day had turned unexpectedly clear, one of those February afternoons that apologizes for winter by performing a brief convincing imitation of early spring. He drove with the window cracked slightly, and the cold air coming in and the radio still off. He picked up Noah at after school. Noah had a permission slip for a science fair that he'd been carrying in his backpack for 3 days without mentioning. He presented it now with the slightly guilty energy of a child who knows they've sat on information past its socially acceptable hold time. It's due tomorrow, Noah said. Of course it is. I already know what I want to do. Yeah? Structural joints. Noah held up the cardboard model he'd been refining for the past week, which had evolved from something bridge-like into something more architecturally complex. Like the ones that hold the most weight but nobody sees. I want to show how they work and why they matter. Liam looked at the model, then at his son. The boy who had his mother's wide, dark eyes and his own stubborn jaw, and absolutely no idea what his father had been doing for the past week, beyond important work and finding something. That's a good topic, Liam said. I know, Noah said. I figured that out when you told me about the destination versus the transition thing. The joints are the transition. They're the part that actually matters. He drove. The late sun came through the windshield at a low angle and lit up the side of Noah's face. The serious, concentrated, unself-conscious face of a kid who was certain about something and didn't feel the need to check whether anyone else agreed. The joints are the transition. They're the part that actually matters. Liam thought about a fitting inside a nacelle, inside an engine mount, inside a wing structure, on 18 aircraft that carried people from place to place at altitude, while those people thought about their phones and their meetings and their dinner reservations and trusted reasonably and completely that the transition would hold. He thought about a 23-year-old at a desk running stress calculations on a component geometry that worried him, and a 47-page concern report that went into a binder that went into an archive that sat for 9 years until a woman named Patricia Osei needed it for Appendix C. He thought about the things that held the greatest weight, working quietly, behind everything else, doing their job in the dark. He signed the permission slip when they got home. Noah made pasta, not as well as Liam made it, but with considerably more confidence. And they ate it at the kitchen table while Noah explained the science fair judging criteria with the seriousness of someone preparing a legal argument. Liam listened. He ate his pasta. Outside, the clear afternoon had given way to a clear evening, and the first stars were showing up over the city in the spaces between the light pollution, faint and patient, doing what they did whether anyone looked or not. The congressional subcommittee hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late February. in a building in Washington that Liam had never been inside before and found, upon arriving, to be both smaller and louder than he'd imagined. The hallways had the particular acoustic quality of marble floors and high ceilings. Every footstep, every conversation, every rolling cart of documents amplified into something that felt vaguely ceremonial even when the content was purely procedural. He'd driven down the night before, not flown. He hadn't planned it that way consciously, but when he'd looked at the flight options, he'd booked the train instead, and then when the train had a scheduling problem, he'd rented a car and driven, and he didn't examine that decision too carefully. He stayed in a hotel 3 blocks from the building, a mid-range place with a breakfast buffet and a view of a parking structure, and slept better than he'd expected. Noah was with Mrs. Delgado for 2 days. He'd left him with the cardboard structural joint model, which Noah had been refining for the science fair with increasing seriousness, and a new library book about deep-sea engineering, the kind of book that existed in the specific overlap between Noah's interest in how things worked underwater and his interest in how things didn't fall apart. He'd texted Liam the previous evening, a photograph of a page spread with a detailed diagram of a subsea pipeline joint, and the message, "This is basically the same problem you have, but wetter." Liam had stared at that text for a moment and then sent back a thumbs up because he didn't have adequate words. He arrived at the hearing room at 8:15. The session didn't start until 10. He had no particular reason to arrive early, except that being early to things was a habit so deep it had stopped feeling like a choice. He found the witness anteroom, set down his bag, looked at the chair assignments, and went to find coffee. He found Ortega instead, in the hallway outside the hearing room, also holding coffee, reading something on his phone with the focused expression of a man reviewing notes he'd already memorized but wanted to memorize more. Ortega looked up. "You drove. How do you know that?" "You drove from Chicago. 8.5 hours. You've got that look." "What look?" "The look of someone who spent a long time alone in a car thinking about what they're going to say today." Ortega pocketed his phone. "I drove too. Different reasons." He sipped his coffee. "Are you ready?" "I don't know what ready means for this," Liam said honestly. "It means you know what's true and you can say it clearly to people who are going to be looking for reasons to misunderstand it." Ortega looked at him. "Based on everything I've read and everything I've seen from you in the past 2 weeks, I think you're ready." The hearing room filled steadily after 9. Liam watched it from the anteroom through a partially open door. The staff arranging materials, the C-SPAN camera crew setting up in the corner, the gradual accumulation of people in the gallery seats who had various relationships to the morning's proceedings and various reasons for being there. He recognized Osei arriving with 2 of her engineers. He recognized Chen from the FAA. He recognized a man from the type certificate holder's legal team who'd been at the FSDO session. He didn't recognize most of the people in the gallery, which he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the woman in the 3rd row, left side, in a dark coat, who he almost missed because she was sitting very still. Ava Sinclair. She wasn't testifying. She hadn't been called. She was in the gallery as an observer, which she was entirely entitled to be. And she was sitting with the contained, forward-focused stillness of someone who had arranged to be there and was going to be present for every minute of it. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He decided he didn't need to feel anything about it specifically and went back to his coffee. The subcommittee chair was a senator from Montana named Gareth Paulson, a large, deliberate man in his mid-60s who had the reputation of being genuinely interested in aviation safety in the specific way that politicians from states with large rural aviation infrastructure tended to be, which was to say, practically and without much patience for abstractions. He opened the session with a statement that was shorter than Liam had expected and more direct than most opening statements he'd read transcripts of. "What we're examining today," Paulson said, "is not a crash. We want to be clear about that. Nobody died. No aircraft was lost. What we are examining is the mechanism by which the system came within approximately 50 flight cycles of a catastrophic accident across multiple aircraft, while a documented, technically sound safety concern sat in an archive for 9 years without triggering any inspection directive or design review." He looked up from his prepared text. "That gap is what interests this committee, not the accident that didn't happen.
the system that almost led it. The first witness was Chen.
She testified for 45 minutes, presenting the FAA investigation's findings in the organized, technically precise language of a career regulatory professional. She was asked about the voluntary reporting system, about the original response to Liam's 2006 submission, about the gap between the concern report's conclusions and the regulatory action that followed it. The exchange that drew the sharpest attention came from a senator from Virginia named Whitmore. No relation to the aircraft manufacturer, a coincidence that had produced exactly one awkward moment at the start of the session. Who asked Chen directly? In your professional assessment, should the voluntary safety concern submission made in 2006 have produced a different regulatory response than it did? Chen paused for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be honest, short enough to not appear evasive. Yes, she said. Based on the technical quality of the submission and the specificity of the concern identified, a more thorough engineering review would have been warranted. The response issued at the time was consistent with standard processing protocols. Those protocols were insufficient for the level of technical detail and specificity present in this particular submission, meaning the system failed. Meaning the system was not designed to recognize the difference between a general safety concern and a detailed engineering analysis, identifying a specific failure mechanism with quantified risk parameters. She paused. That is a design gap that this committee's attention may help address. Paulson made a note. Ortega testified next. He spoke for 35 minutes, and his testimony had a different quality than Chen's. Less procedural, more forensic, the account of a man who spent his career working backward from wreckage, and who understood, in a way that was almost physical, what wreckage looked like when it arrived. He presented the crack propagation modeling, the remaining life estimates at the time of discovery, the probability analysis for each of the 4 affected aircraft. He used no rhetorical flourish. He didn't need to. The numbers were sufficient. When he was asked about the Crest Air aircraft, the one with the 22mm primary crack and 50 cycles remaining, he said, "At the rate of operations Crest Air was conducting with that aircraft, we estimate it would have reached probable failure within 4 to 6 weeks. It was operating on a charter schedule that included several high-cycle routes. The passengers on those flights would have had no knowledge of any structural concern. The maintenance crew servicing the aircraft between flights would not have been directed to inspect the affected location. The crack would have continued growing invisibly until it didn't need to grow anymore." The room was very quiet. "And then?" Senator Whitmore asked. "And then the engine would have separated from the wing," Ortega said, "at cruise altitude, overpopulated airspace, with 12 passengers aboard." He paused. "There would have been no recovery from that failure mode. Not at altitude, not with the speed of structural sequence once primary load transfer is lost." The quiet deepened. Paulson cleared his throat. "Mr. Ortega, in your professional assessment, and I want to be precise here, was the discovery of this crack on the initial aircraft a function of the inspection system working as designed, or was it something else?" Ortega considered the question with visible care. "It was not a function of the inspection system working as designed," he said. "The standard inspection protocol applicable to the G7 airframe at the time of the Meridian grounding did not include a directed inspection of the lower engine mount fitting at the attachment bore. The crack found by Mr. Carter was not detectable by walk-around inspection or standard bore scope protocol directed at the engine interior." He paused. "The crack was found because the inspector who performed the Meridian inspection had prior engineering knowledge of the specific vulnerability, knowledge acquired during his work on the original design program 9 years earlier, and applied that knowledge to direct his inspection beyond standard protocol parameters." Another pause. "In simple terms, the system did not find the crack. A man found the crack. A man who knew exactly where to look because he had spent 9 years knowing that nobody else was looking there." That sentence sat in the room for a long moment. Liam was called third. He walked to the witness table with his documentation binder and his prepared statement, which he'd written himself over 3 evenings at the kitchen table while Noah did homework across from him, occasionally reading sentences aloud and asking Noah if they were clear. Noah had said most of them were fine, and 2 of them were confusing, and Liam had rewritten the 2 confusing ones. He adjusted the microphone. He looked at the panel of senators. He thought briefly and incongruously about Noah's cardboard joint model, which was currently on the kitchen counter waiting to be transported to the school science fair. "Mr. Carter," Paulson said, "thank you for being here. Please begin when you're ready." He read the prepared statement. It took 11 minutes. It covered the engineering background, the original concern report, the decision to pursue inspection certification, the Meridian inspection, and the fleet-wide findings. It was factual and sequential, and he'd written it to be understood by someone with no engineering background, which meant some precision was sacrificed, but precision wasn't what this room needed most. When he finished, Paulson said, "Thank you. I'd like to open with a question that I think is on everyone's mind in this room." He looked at Liam directly. "When you walked into that hangar on the night of the Meridian inspection, did you go in expecting to find a problem?" "No," Liam said. "I went in expecting to do a standard pre-flight inspection and sign off on a flight. But you found a problem." "I found a crack, yes." "Because you knew where to look." "Because I had prior knowledge of a design concern I'd identified 9 years earlier, and when I was in front of that specific aircraft, that prior knowledge directed my inspection beyond standard parameters." He paused. "I want to be careful about how this is characterized. I'm not suggesting that every inspector needs to have been an engineer on every aircraft they inspect. That's not realistic, and it's not the right lesson. The right lesson is that when a qualified engineer submits a detailed, technically sound safety concern, identifying a specific failure mechanism, the system should have a mechanism to translate that concern into an inspection directive, so that every inspector looking at that aircraft type is directed to look at the right place, not just the inspector who happened to write the original analysis." Paulson wrote something. Senator Whitmore leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, the concern report you submitted through the voluntary reporting system in 2006. The response you received indicated the matter had been reviewed and was consistent with acceptable parameters. When you received that response, what did you do?" "I accepted it," Liam said. "I had done what I could do within the available system. The system had processed my submission and returned a conclusion. I disagreed with the conclusion, but I didn't have a mechanism to appeal it or escalate it further." He paused. "So I made a different decision. I pursued inspection certification so that I could continue to work with aircraft in a role where my findings had direct regulatory authority, where I couldn't be overruled by a program manager or a risk assessment committee. I made myself useful in the place where I could actually make a difference." "And 9 years later," Whitmore said, "you walked into a hangar and found exactly what you'd been looking for." "I wasn't looking for it," Liam said. "I was just doing my job. But yes, it was there." Had it always been there? In some form. Cracks don't appear overnight. The initiation mechanism I identified 9 years ago would have begun producing microscopic damage accumulation from the early service cycles. What I found on the Meridian aircraft was 9 years of progressive fatigue damage that had grown from something invisible to something I could detect with the equipment I had. He paused. The crack was always going to be there. The question was whether anyone would be looking at the right place when it got big enough to find. A senator from Texas named Bowen, who had been quiet through most of the testimony, leaned forward. He was younger than the others on the panel, maybe early 50s, with the direct manner of someone who'd come up through business before politics. "Mr. Carter, I want to ask you about the pressure you experienced on the night of the grounding, the financial offer, the pushback from the operators team. In your experience, and I understand you've been doing this work for 7 years, is that kind of pressure common?" Liam considered the question. "It's not uncommon," he said carefully. "Most inspectors don't face it at the level I experienced that particular evening. The financial scale, the number of people involved, the visibility of the operator, those are unusual factors. But the underlying pressure, the pressure to clear an aircraft, to not be the person who creates a problem, to defer to the operator's confidence in their own maintenance program, that exists in most high-stakes inspection environments to some degree. And your ability to resist that pressure," Bowen said, "where does that come from?" It was a different kind of question than the others, more personal. He hadn't prepared an answer for it, which meant he had to find an honest one in real time. "From understanding what the alternative looks like," he said. "I spent 4 years as a structural engineer thinking about how aircraft failed, not dramatically, incrementally, invisibly. I understand what a crack does over time. I understand what happens when a primary load path fails at altitude. He paused. When you understand that in detail, the pressure from a CFO becomes a lot easier to manage. The pressure and the crack are not equivalent forces. One of them has real consequences. Bowen nodded slowly. The testimony continued for another hour and 20 minutes. He was asked about the voluntary reporting system in detail, its strengths, its gaps, his specific experience with it. He was asked about the inspection training curriculum and whether it adequately prepared inspectors to go beyond standard protocol parameters when knowledge or evidence warranted it. He was asked about the relationship between the engineering certification process and the in-service inspection regime, and the mechanism by which safety-relevant engineering knowledge could or couldn't move from one world to the other. He answered every question as precisely as he could. When he didn't know something, he said he didn't know. When a question moved outside his expertise, he said so and redirected to what he did know. At one point, Senator Paulson asked, "Mr. Carter, if the concern report you submitted in 2006 had been appropriately translated into an inspection directive, if that system had worked the way it should have worked, where would we be today?" Liam looked at him. The crack would have been found years ago in an aircraft that still had substantial structural life remaining. The modification I proposed would likely have been incorporated into the maintenance program or the design. The fleet would have been corrected. He paused. We would not be here today because there would be nothing to be here about. Paulson held his gaze. And the Crest Air aircraft would have been inspected and corrected before it came within 50 cycles of catastrophic failure. A pause. The people who were planning to board that aircraft in the next 4 to 6 weeks would not know, would never know, that anything had been different. They would have boarded normally and arrived normally and gone about their lives. He paused. That is what a functioning system looks like. People who never know what didn't happen to them. The session broke at 12:30 for lunch. Liam gathered his materials, returned to the anteroom, and sat down in a chair and didn't move for approximately 3 minutes. He was not emotional in any dramatic sense. He was simply very tired. The particular exhaustion of sustained precision, of choosing every word carefully for 2.5 hours in a room where the words mattered and he knew they mattered. He heard the door open and looked up. Ava Sinclair came in. She was still in the dark coat. She looked at him with the direct, unsettled expression he'd first seen on her face in the Meridian hangar, the expression she had when she'd run out of executive composure and was operating on something more basic. "You did that well," she said. "I just answered questions. You answered them in a way that might actually change something." She paused. "That's different." He looked at her. She had the look of someone who had been sitting in the gallery for 3 hours processing things she hadn't been fully prepared to process. There was something in her face that he'd seen building over the past 2 weeks. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of reckoning. The slow arrival of understanding what had almost happened on a scale beyond the personal. "I didn't expect you to come," he said. "I needed to be here." She sat down across from him, not in the chair closest to him, but one further along, leaving appropriate space. "The Crest Air aircraft," she said. 50 cycles. "Yes." "I keep thinking about the passengers, the ones who were going to board it next week, and the week after." She looked at her hands. "They would have had no idea." "No. They trust the system." She looked up. "The way I trusted our maintenance records." "That's what the system is supposed to justify," he said. "The trust." He paused. "When it works." She was quiet for a moment. "Marcus has been managing the regulatory response. He's been..." She paused. "He's been better than I expected. He took your point, I think, about what we do with the information now." "I noticed," Liam said, "the speed of the fleet inspections, the voluntary notification to the international operators before the FAA directive required it. That was a decision someone made." "Marcus made it." She paused. "I told him to, but he agreed before I finished the sentence." A small beat. "I think nearly being on an aircraft with a 22mm fatigue crack concentrated his mind considerably." Liam almost smiled. Not quite. "Alcott called me," Ava said. He looked at her. "When?" 3 days ago."
after the story about the concern report went wide. She crossed her arms loosely. He's cooperating with the investigation, voluntarily. His attorney advised against it, and he's doing it anyway. She paused. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it, Liam said. The investigation will do what it does. He asked about you, He asked if you were okay. Those were his exact words. She looked at Liam steadily. I told him you seemed like someone who'd been okay for a long time. Liam looked at her. Was that accurate? She considered it honestly. I don't know. Is it? He thought about the question the way he'd thought about it at 2 a.m. in the week after the grounding, directly, without self-pity, which was the only useful way to think about it. Mostly, he said, there are parts of the last 9 years I wouldn't choose again if I had the option. The exit from Vandermeer, the year after it, He stopped. Some of the personal consequences of that period. He didn't elaborate on what those were, and she didn't ask. But mostly, yes, she nodded. How's the company? He asked. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Complicated. The Hartwell deal is in formal renegotiation. They haven't walked away, which surprised me. The gray-haired woman who deplaned after you told her to, her name is Eleanor Hartwell, she's the managing partner, she called me herself 2 days after the grounding. She said the decision I made in that hangar to let you do your job told her more about how I run things than any investor presentation could have. She paused. She said companies that get out of the way of the truth are the companies she bets on. That's a generous reading of events, Liam said. She's a generous reader when the evidence supports it. Ava paused. The company is bruised. The stock hasn't fully recovered. We have significant costs from the fleet inspections, the regulatory compliance, the fitting replacements, and we own those costs even for the aircraft we don't operate because the concern originated in our fleet. She paused. But we're still here, and everyone who was on that aircraft is still here. She looked at him directly.
That matters more than the rest of it. I know that now in a way I didn't know it 2 weeks ago. After lunch, the hearing resumed for a second session focused on legislative recommendations. What regulatory changes, what system modifications, what new protocols might address the gaps the morning's testimony had identified. Liam wasn't the primary witness in this session, but he was asked several specific questions about the voluntary reporting system and what a better version of it might look like. He'd thought about this more than anything else in the previous 2 weeks. More than the investigation, more than the testimony preparation, more than the media coverage that had continued and grown and taken on a shape he hadn't anticipated or sought. He thought about it the way he thought about structural problems, from first principles, from the failure mode backward to the system that should have prevented it. The voluntary safety reporting system receives thousands of submissions, he said. Most of them are operational concerns, runway incursions, ATC communications, maintenance procedural issues. It's designed to process volume. What it isn't designed to do is recognize the difference between a general safety observation and a detailed engineering analysis containing a specific, testable, falsifiable prediction about a failure mechanism. He paused. What I submitted in 2006 was the latter. It contained a load analysis, a stress concentration calculation, a crack initiation prediction, and a proposed modification with engineering rationale. It was a complete engineering argument, not a safety concern report. The system processed it as if it were the same category of thing. It isn't. What would a better system look like? Paulson asked. A triage mechanism, a technical review pathway that routes submissions containing quantified engineering analysis to engineering staff, not safety reporting coordinators, for substantive review. A feedback mechanism that requires the reviewer to engage with the specific technical claims, not just the general risk category. And a translation mechanism that converts confirmed engineering concerns into inspection directives within a defined timeline. He paused. If those 3 things had existed in 2006, my concern report would have been reviewed by someone with the engineering background to evaluate the load analysis. The specific failure mechanism would have been confirmed or refuted on technical grounds, and if confirmed, an inspection directive would have been issued directing inspectors to examine the exact location I identified. He paused, instead of me doing it alone in a hangar 11 years later with a flashlight. Senator Paulson wrote something. Then he looked up. Mr. Carter. One last question. And this is outside the formal scope of the hearing, but I think the people in this room deserve to hear it. He looked at Liam steadily. When you were in that hangar and the financial offer was on the table, and every person in the room was telling you to let the flight go, what did you think about? The room was quiet. Liam thought about the question, about the true answer, which he hadn't actually articulated to anyone. I thought about the flight path, he said. Meridian to Harrington, 2 hours, 20 minutes, over populated areas, cruise altitude somewhere around 41,000 feet. He paused. I thought about the load cycle, the thrust on takeoff, the loads on the fitting at rotation and during climb, whether the crack, at the geometry I'd measured, would propagate under that specific load sequence. He paused. And then I thought about 11 people sitting in a pressurized cabin at 41,000 feet with no way to know any of that. He looked at Paulson directly. The financial offer stopped being a relevant factor at that point. It was just a number. And the number didn't change what was in the metal. The hearing ended at 4:15. He drove back to Chicago the next morning, leaving the hotel at 6, stopping once for gas and coffee somewhere in Indiana where the highway stretched flat and gray and perfectly straight in both directions as far as he could see. He drove with the radio on for the first time in weeks. Not news, just music, something with a steady beat and no lyrics he needed to follow. And the miles passed. He thought about what came next. Not in the large sense, that was for other people to determine. The senators and regulators and aviation authorities and type certificate holders and operators who would take the testimony and the investigation findings and turn them into whatever system changes they were going to make. That part was out of his hands, and he was comfortable with that. He thought about the specific and the immediate, the fitting replacements on the affected aircraft, the new inspection directive that the FAA had already issued and would expand, the 4 aircraft that had been found, the 12 aircraft worldwide that had been inspected and found clean, which meant either they hadn't developed cracks yet or the inspection protocol, now more directed, had found clean fittings, the ongoing monitoring that would continue. He thought about NOAA's science fair, which was the following Friday, and which he absolutely could not miss. He thought about Patricia Osei, who had called him the previous morning to say that the type certificate holder had formally agreed to incorporate his original proposed modification, the reinforcement plate, and revised bore geometry, into the next maintenance revision for all G7 aircraft in service, and that Sinclair Aerotech had announced they would fund the modification for the entire international fleet as part of their airworthiness commitment program. She'd said it in her characteristically flat, factual voice, and then she'd been quiet for a moment, and then she'd said, 47 pages, 9 years ago, and it's going into the maintenance revision. He'd said yes, and then neither of them had said anything for a moment because there wasn't anything adequate to say. He crossed into Illinois just before noon. The flat farmland on either side of the highway was winter gray and enormous, stretching to a horizon that was just slightly lighter than the sky above it. He drove through it and thought about nothing and everything and let the miles go past. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced at it at a red light on the outskirts of the city. A text from Noah, who was apparently at Mrs. Delgado's watching something educational and had stopped to send him the following message. Did you know that the deepest ocean trenches have never been fully mapped? Because the pressure makes it really hard to build equipment that survives long enough? Kind of like inspecting something that's hard to reach. He read it twice. Then the light changed and he drove on, and the city built itself up around him gradually. The flat horizon replaced by buildings and overpasses, and the dense, ordinary architecture of a place where people lived their regular lives in the confident assumption that the structures holding everything together were sound. Most of the time, they were. He pulled into his parking spot at 12:47, carried his bag upstairs, and stood in his apartment in his coat for a moment before taking it off. The kitchen was exactly as he'd left it. Noah's cardboard joint model was on the counter, slightly more refined than before Mrs. Delgado had evidently let him work on it. A small modification at one of the primary load points that was, objectively, a better solution than the previous version. He stood and looked at it for a while. Then he took off his coat, put on coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. He had a lot of paperwork to catch up on. The paperwork took 3 days to catch up on. Not because there was so much of it, though there was, but because every form, every supplemental report, every response to every regulatory inquiry required the same careful precision that all his documentation required, and he wasn't willing to let the weight of the past 3 weeks make him careless about it. He sat at the kitchen table each evening after Noah went to bed and worked through it methodically, the way he worked through everything, 1 page at a time, each sentence checked against what he actually knew versus what he assumed. Noah's science fair was on Friday. He did not miss it. The gymnasium of Noah's school had been transformed in the way school gymnasiums always were for these events. Folding tables arranged in rows, trifold poster boards, the specific combination of concentration and performance anxiety that existed only in rooms full of 9 and 10-year-olds who had made things and were now required to explain them to adults. Liam arrived at 6 and found Noah at table 11, standing behind his project with the upright, slightly rigid posture of someone who had rehearsed and was ready. The project was titled, in Noah's careful block printing, The Hidden Joints, How Invisible Connections Carry the Greatest Weight. The cardboard model had been expanded. What had started as a rough structural prototype on the kitchen counter was now a proper demonstration piece, a cross-section model showing 3 different joint configurations, each one bearing a labeled load, each one color-coded to show where stress concentrated. Noah had added annotations in his handwriting explaining why the geometry of the connection mattered, why a small change in angle or material could mean the difference between a joint that held and one that failed slowly and invisibly over time. There was a section on the right side of the poster board titled Real-World Applications. It listed bridges, skyscrapers, aircraft, and subsea pipelines. Under aircraft, it said, the hidden fittings that hold the engine to the wing. Most passengers never think about them. They should. Liam stood in front of the poster for a long moment. You're not supposed to just read it, Noah said. You're supposed to ask me questions. That's how the judging works. Right. Liam straightened. Walk me through the load distribution model. Noah walked him through it with the focused, slightly too fast delivery of a kid who knew the material cold and was trying not to go too fast. He explained stress concentration factors without using that exact term. He called it where the pressure likes to pile up. And he explained crack initiation without using that term either. He called it where things decide to start breaking, slowly, before you can see it. He explained why the joint geometry mattered. He explained why the same load applied at 2 different angles produced completely different outcomes in the metal. He was 9 years old and he had figured out, from a cardboard model on a kitchen counter and a library book about deep-sea engineering, the same fundamental insight that had taken Liam 4 years of aerospace engineering education and 2 more years of design work to understand in formal terms. That's very good, Liam said when Noah finished. I know, Noah said without false modesty or arrogance, just as a statement of fact. Then, did I get the aircraft part right? The engine fitting thing? Where did you read about that? I didn't. I figured it out from the geometry. An engine is heavy and it moves and it creates thrust loads and vibration loads simultaneously, which means the fitting holding it has to handle multiple directions of force at the same time, which means the connection point is where things are most likely to... He stopped. Did I get it right? Yes, Liam said. You got it right. Noah nodded, satisfied. A judge appeared at the table and Noah turned to deliver the presentation again, and Liam stepped back and let him. He stood at the edge of the gymnasium and watched his son explain hidden structural connections to a woman with a clipboard and a patient expression, and something settled in him that had been slightly unsettled for, he realized standing there, a long time. Not 3 weeks, not 9 years, longer than that. The unsettled feeling of a person who has spent a significant portion of their life doing work that mattered in ways that were invisible to almost everyone, including sometimes themselves. Noah won second place. He was philosophical about not winning first. The volcano was more visually interesting, he said on the drive home, with the equanimity of a person who had already moved on to thinking about next year. But mine was more technically rigorous. Both things can be true, Liam said. I know. Noah looked out the window. Dad, is the stuff you testified about, is it going to actually change anything? I don't know yet. But it might. It might. Noah considered this. The second place ribbon is still pretty good, he said, apparently satisfied with that equivalence, and went back to looking out the window. The call from Ava Sinclair's office came on a Tuesday morning 3.5 weeks after the congressional hearing. Not from Ava directly, from her executive assistant, a composed and efficient woman named Linda who scheduled things with the smooth precision of someone who had made a career of managing the time of a person who had very little of it. She asked if Liam would be available to meet with Ms. Sinclair the following week at Sinclair Aerotech's headquarters in Hartford. She mentioned that Ms. Sinclair would cover travel. He said he'd drive. Linda paused briefly at that, then said of course, and gave him the address and a parking validation code. He told Noah he had a meeting in Connecticut. Noah asked if he could come. Liam said no. Noah asked if Connecticut was interesting. Liam said he didn't know. He'd never been. Noah said he'd looked it up and it was historically significant but geographically compact and left it at that. He drove to Hartford on a Wednesday morning in early March. The winter was loosening its grip incrementally, the kind of almost spring that kept making promises it wasn't quite ready to keep, warm enough in the sun to feel like something, cold enough in the shade to remind you it wasn't yet. He drove through it with the window cracked and the radio on and thought, for most of the drive, about nothing particular. Sinclair Aerotech's headquarters was a modern building in a business district that had the clean, intentional architecture of a company that had grown fast enough to build something new rather than inherit something old. Glass and steel and the particular confidence of a structure that knew exactly what it was. He parked in the validated space and went inside. The lobby was quieter than he'd expected. He'd half imagined the compressed, high-energy atmosphere of a company in crisis management mode, people moving fast, phones ringing, the ambient noise of institutional stress. Instead, it was calm. Not artificially so, just the ordinary working calm of people doing their jobs on a Wednesday. The receptionist directed him to the 4th floor. Linda met him at the elevator and walked him down a hallway to a corner office with windows on 2 sides that looked out over the city. It was a good office. Not ostentatious, but large enough and well organized, with a conference table separate from the desk and a whiteboard on one wall covered in a diagram that he recognized as a regulatory compliance timeline. Ava Sinclair was at the whiteboard when he came in. She turned, capped her marker, and crossed to shake his hand. She looked different than she had at the hearing, less compressed. The contained energy quality he'd noticed from the first evening was still there. He suspected it was simply how she was built, but something around her eyes was less tight. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was living on the other side of it. "How was the drive?" she asked. "Fine, I like driving." "I gathered." She gestured to the conference table. "Sit down. Do you want anything? Coffee?" "I'm fine." They sat across the table from each other. She had a thin folder in front of her that she didn't open immediately. He had his inspection bag on the floor beside his chair, which he'd brought out of habit and which was irrelevant to this meeting, but which he'd reached for automatically when he was leaving home and hadn't put back. "I'll get to the point," she said. "I want to offer you a position here." He looked at her. "Director of Safety and Airworthiness," she said. "Newly created role, reporting directly to me. Scope includes overseeing the airworthiness program for our operated fleet, our maintenance contracts, our regulatory compliance, and our internal safety reporting system." She paused. "With a specific mandate to build a technical safety review process, the kind you described at the hearing, where engineering quality safety concerns get engineering quality review, and where inspectors and maintenance personnel have direct escalation authority to your office with your full institutional support behind them." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the March sky was doing its almost spring performance. Pale blue, thin clouds, the kind of light that looked warmer than it was. "That's a significant role," he said. "Yes." "I don't have executive experience." "You have something I can't hire for," she said directly. "I can find executives. I have executives. What I don't have, what this company has never had, is someone at the senior level whose instinct, when pressure is applied to a safety decision, is to hold the line." She paused. "You held the line in my hangar with my CFO, my captain, my investors, and a financial offer on the table. I watched it. I know what that cost you in that room." She held his gaze. I need that person making safety decisions for this company, not someone who'll fold when the timeline gets tight or the costs get uncomfortable. He looked at the regulatory timeline on her whiteboard. He looked at the folder she still hadn't opened. The authority structure, he said. If I flag an airworthiness concern, on an aircraft we operate, on a maintenance procedure, on anything in the safety domain, what happens? You ground it, she said. No approvals required. No CFO sign-off. No timeline review. Your finding, your authority. She paused. And anyone in the maintenance or inspection chain who reports a safety concern to your office is protected from any operational pressure or employment consequence. Full stop. I'll put that in writing in the role charter, and I'll sign it myself. What about your board? I've briefed them. They understand that the alternative to building this kind of safety infrastructure is another emergency airworthiness directive, another grounded fleet, another congressional hearing. She paused. Eleanor Hartwell, specifically, was very clear on that point. The gray-haired woman, he said. The corner of Ava's mouth moved. She told me to tell you she was sorry for the way she spoke to you on the air stairs. She said, and I'm quoting, "Tell him I knew he was right the moment I saw his face, and I should have said so then instead of making him ask me twice." He absorbed that. She doesn't need to apologize. I know, she wanted to anyway. Ava paused. Will you look at the offer? She opened the folder and slid it across the table. He looked at it. The compensation was substantially beyond anything he'd earned in his inspection career, not wildly beyond what the role warranted, but enough to change the practical texture of his life in ways he could immediately enumerate. The apartment lease he'd been renewing annually and had been considering for years, Noah's college fund that existed in a state of good intentions and insufficient monthly contributions, the car with 140,000 miles on it that he was maintaining through optimism and mechanical competence. He read the role charter carefully. The authority language was specific and unambiguous. The escalation protections for inspection and maintenance staff were written in terms that didn't hedge. The reporting structure was direct. Ava had clearly thought about this, or had someone think about it, in detail. He looked up. I want to make one addition to the role charter. Tell me. The authority to ground applies regardless of operational pressure, timeline, or financial consequence. We've covered that. He paused. I also want language that requires the company to notify me if any external party, investor, board member, client, regulatory contact, attempts to apply pressure to a safety finding through any channel other than the formal technical review process. I don't want to find out 6 months in that someone has been running an end-around through your CFO. She looked at him for a moment. Marcus won't do that. I know, he said. I believe that. I still want the language. She held his gaze, then she nodded. I'll add it. He looked back at the folder. He thought about his inspection bag on the floor beside his chair. He thought about 7 years of pre-flight walkarounds and borescope inspections and documentation forms and fluorescent-lit hangars at 11 o'clock at night. He thought about Tuesday evenings and macaroni and cheese and a 9-year-old who asked precise questions about structural mechanics without knowing that was what he was doing. He thought about what Osei had said in the Meridian hangar. Those aren't separate stories. They're the same one. 9 years ago, he'd identified the cause. 3 weeks ago, he'd stopped the consequence. This was the next chapter of the same story, building the system that prevented the cause from becoming the consequence in the first place. Yes, he said. I'll take it. Something shifted in Ava's face. Not triumph. She didn't seem like a person who led with triumph. Relief, maybe. The specific relief of someone who had been trying to do the right thing and had found the right person to help her do it. Good, she said. She reached across the table and they shook hands. Her grip was exactly as it had been in the Meridian hangar 3 weeks ago. Firm, brief, no performance in it. When can you start? I need to give notice at Meridian. 6 weeks. I'll wait. And I need to talk to my son. She blinked. Your son? It's a significant change for both of us. He paused. He has opinions about things. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. How old is he? 9. And he has opinions about your career moves. He has opinions about everything. He's very well informed. He paused. He won second place at his science fair last week. His project was about hidden structural connections and how they carry the greatest weight. A silence. Then Ava laughed. A real one. Sudden and unguarded. Nothing like the controlled professional composure he'd been managing around for weeks. It lasted only a moment, but it was completely genuine and it changed the shape of the room slightly. "Bring him to Hartford when you start," she said. "I want to meet him." He drove back to Chicago that afternoon. The almost spring had decided to make good on its promises for the remaining hours of daylight. The sun was out properly now, the kind of March afternoon that felt like something had been agreed upon between the season and the sky. He drove with the windows down further than was strictly comfortable and didn't mind. He called Mrs. Delgado from the road and asked if she could have Noah ready by 7, that he'd be home by then. Mrs. Delgado said of course, and also that Noah had discovered a crack in her garden wall that afternoon and had developed a highly specific theory about the load-bearing implications, and would Liam please come prepared to discuss it. He said he would. He was home by 6:50. Noah was waiting by the door in the specific posture of a child who has important things to discuss and has been managing the delay badly. He launched immediately into the garden wall situation, which involved a diagonal crack running from a corner brick approximately 14 inches toward the center of the wall, and his theory that the crack's angle indicated it was shear-driven rather than compression-driven, which had different implications for whether the wall needed repair now or could be monitored. "Where did you learn the word shear in this context?" Liam asked. "The library book." Noah paused. "Was I right?" "Probably. I'd need to look at it." "We could look at it tomorrow." "Okay." They made dinner together. Actual pasta, not from a box, the kind that required attention. And Noah talked through the wall crack with increasing technical sophistication, while Liam cooked and listened and corrected 2 things and confirmed 6 others. After dinner, they sat at the kitchen table with Noah's homework spread between them, and when the homework was done and the table was cleared, Liam told him about Hartford. He told it simply. New job, different city. No, wait, they wouldn't move unless Noah wanted to. He could commute initially, figure out the geography of it, see how it worked. The job involved building a safety system for an aviation company. It meant he'd be working on preventing the kind of problem he'd found at Meridian across a whole company, systemically, instead of one aircraft at a time. Noah listened with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he considered genuinely important. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 clarifying questions, one about what director meant in an organizational sense, and one about whether Hartford was closer or further from the ocean than Chicago, for reasons Liam didn't fully track. Then he was quiet for a moment. "So instead of finding problems," Noah said, "you'd be building the system that finds them." "Yes, and building the protection for the people who find them. So inspectors don't get pressured to let unsafe things go." "That's part of it." Noah looked at the table. He was doing the thing he did when he was processing something. His jaw moved slightly, the way it always did when thinking was happening that hadn't finished yet. Then he looked up. "Okay," he said, "but I want to see Hartford first." "Deal. And I get to meet the CEO." "She already asked." Noah nodded, apparently satisfied. "Then, is the second place ribbon appropriate to bring? As a conversation starter?" Liam looked at his son, at the wide dark eyes and the stubborn jaw and the 9 years of evidence that this specific person was going to be fine, was already fine in the ways that mattered, despite everything that had made his early years harder than they should have been, despite a father who worked odd hours and worried about metal, and came home some nights with the specific silence of a man who had been carrying something heavy and hadn't yet put it down. "Yes, Sauce," Liam said. "Bring the ribbon." The investigation's findings were published 6 weeks later. The full report ran to 212 pages and covered the engineering failure mode, the fleet inspection results, the historical documentation trail, the gap in the voluntary reporting system, and 17 specific recommendations for regulatory and industry reform. Liam's original concern report appeared in the appendix. His name appeared 38 times in the body of the report, which he knew because Noah had counted them. The FAA adopted 9 of the 17 recommendations within the first 90 days. 4 more were incorporated into proposed rulemaking within 6 months. The voluntary safety reporting system was restructured to include a technical triage pathway, exactly the mechanism Liam had described at the hearing, where submissions containing quantified engineering analysis were routed to specialist review. It was named, in the dry language of regulatory documents, the Enhanced Technical Safety Review Protocol. Nobody named it after him. He hadn't expected them to. The system didn't work that way, and he wouldn't have wanted it to. Dennis Alcott cooperated fully with the regulatory investigation. The investigators' report noted, in measured but unambiguous language, that the risk reclassification decision made at Vandermeer 9 years earlier had been inadequately supported by the technical evidence available at the time, and that the proper weighting of Liam's concern report would have warranted further engineering review. Alcott faced no criminal charges. The decision had been institutional as much as individual, and the investigation was interested in the system rather than punishment. He did not return to a senior role in aviation. He made a statement through his attorney that was brief and did not attempt to rehabilitate the decision. Liam read it once and didn't read it again. The modification Liam had proposed 9 years ago, the reinforcement plate and revised board geometry, was incorporated into the G7 maintenance program and applied to every aircraft in the fleet. Sinclair Aerotech funded the modification for all international operators as promised. The cost was significant. The company absorbed it and said nothing about it publicly beyond a brief press statement describing it as a commitment to airworthiness leadership. Eleanor Hartwell's investment consortium completed the deal with Sinclair Aerotech 4 months after the Meridian grounding. The terms were different from what had been originally negotiated. The Connecticut meeting that never happened had been replaced by a 6-week process of financial disclosure, operational review, and the specific kind of institutional trust building that couldn't be compressed into a 2-hour flight. The deal that emerged was more comprehensive, more carefully structured, and valued the company at a figure that was actually higher than the original projection, because Eleanor Hartwell, as it turned out, placed a premium on organizations that demonstrated what she called moral load-bearing capacity. Her words. She sent Liam a handwritten note when the deal closed. It said, "Thank you for the second chance at getting this right. E.H." He put it in his desk drawer. His first 6 months at Sinclair Aerotech were not smooth. He'd expected that. Building something new inside an existing institution was never smooth. It required a kind of persistent, unhurried pressure against the natural resistance of systems that had been working one way for a long time and saw no immediate reason to work differently. There were people who understood what he was trying to do and supported it. There were people who understood it and found it inconvenient. There were people who didn't understand it and had to be educated, which was its own sustained project. He had one serious confrontation in the 3rd month, with a regional operations manager named DeSalvo, who had grounded an aircraft for a hydraulic issue and then been pressured by the charter client to expedite the repair certification and return the aircraft to service before Liam's team had completed their review. DeSalvo had called Liam's office, and Liam had driven 3 hours to the facility personally and stood in the hangar and reviewed the repair and told the charter client directly and without diplomatic softening that the aircraft would return to service when his office signed off and not before. The charter client made a formal complaint to Marcus Webb. Webb forwarded it to Liam's office with a note that said, "Your call, MW." He filed the complaint appropriately, and the aircraft returned to service 2 days later, correctly. DeSalvo had shaken his hand afterward in the parking lot and said, "I didn't think you'd actually come." "I told you I would," Liam said. "People say things." DeSalvo shrugged. Different thing, doing them. That was more or less how the first year went. He commuted from Chicago for the first 4 months while Noah finished the school year. They made the drive to Hartford together on a Saturday in late June, Noah in the passenger seat with a library book about tidal engineering and a bag of chips and opinions about every highway junction they passed through. They found an apartment in a neighborhood that Noah approved of after a 20-minute walking inspection that focused primarily on the structural condition of the older buildings and the quality of the nearby library. It was a good apartment. 3rd floor. Good light. A kitchen table big enough to spread paperwork across while someone else did homework on the opposite side. Noah started a new school in September. He was fine. He was the kind of kid who was fine, not because nothing was hard, but because his relationship with hard things was fundamentally practical. He assessed, he adapted, he made friends with two other kids who had specific interests in how things worked, and by October he was involved in an after-school engineering club that he described as mostly people arguing about load paths, which he found deeply congenial. Ava Sinclair met him on a Thursday afternoon in September, when Liam brought him to the office for a reason now lost to the ordinary accumulation of schedule logistics. Noah came in with his backpack and the second-place ribbon, which he had indeed brought, and he shook Ava's hand with the focused seriousness of a person conducting a professional meeting and said, "I read about your company. I think the Airworthiness Initiative is the right structural approach." Ava looked at him, then at Liam, then back at Noah. "Thank you," she said. "I think so too." "The hidden joints carry the greatest weight," Noah said, referencing his science fair title with complete unself-consciousness. "My dad understood that before I did, but I figured it out." "He's mentioned your project," Ava said. "The science fair. I got second place. The volcano was more visually interesting, but mine was more technically rigorous." He paused. "That's a trade-off, not a defeat." Ava looked at Liam with an expression that contained several things simultaneously. He didn't try to interpret all of them. "That's a good way to look at it," she said. There was a moment, late in the autumn of that year, that Liam returned to sometimes, not obsessively, not with any particular weight attached to it, but the way you return to a moment that contains something true and specific that you want to keep from going vague. He was at his desk in Hartford at the end of a long Thursday, the office mostly empty, the city outside the windows doing its early November thing where the light went gray and golden simultaneously in the last hour before dark. He was reviewing the first quarterly report from the Enhanced Technical Safety Review Protocol, the new FAA system, the one he'd described at the hearing, the one that now existed. The report covered the first 6 months of operation. In that period, the system had processed 47 submissions that qualified for technical triage review. Of those 47, 11 had resulted in follow-up engineering assessments. Of those 11, 3 had produced findings significant enough to generate inspection directives. 3 inspection directives. 3 aircraft types now being looked at more carefully, in the right places, by inspectors who had been told specifically where to look and why. The people who would eventually board those aircraft didn't know about any of this. They would board normally and arrive normally and go on with their lives. They would never know what hadn't happened to them, because nothing had happened to them. Because somewhere in the invisible machinery of certification and inspection and regulatory oversight, someone had looked at the right place at the right time. That was what a functioning system looked like. People who never needed to know. He sat with that for a moment. Then he closed the report and shut down his computer and picked up his jacket and his inspection bag. Still the same worn bag, corners soft with 11 years of use, the reading glasses inside, the photograph of Noah. And he went home. Noah was at the kitchen table when he came in, working on something that involved a ruler, a protractor, and a technical drawing that had the focused ambition of a project not yet limited by what was achievable. He looked up when Liam came in, assessed him with the same directness he assessed everything, and said, "You look tired." "Long day." "Good tired or bad tired?" Liam set his bag down and looked at his son. At the evidence of a person becoming, at the 9-year-old who had become a 10-year-old and would become everything after that, carrying forward the accumulated weight of what he'd been taught and what he'd figured out himself, and what he'd simply absorbed from living in proximity to someone who showed up and held the line and came home and told him about it afterward. "Good tired," Liam said. Noah nodded and went back to his drawing. Liam made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the November evening settling over Hartford. The city lights were coming on, one by one, the way they always did. Not all at once, but incrementally, building the illuminated version of a place where people lived their lives in the ordinary confident assumption that the structures holding everything together were sound. He thought about a fitting inside a nacelle, about a 47-page report, and 9 years and a Tuesday night in a hangar in Illinois. He thought about Patricia Osei saying those aren't separate stories. He thought about a 22mm crack and 50 cycles, and 12 passengers who had never known they were 50 cycles from not existing. He thought about Alcott's voice on the phone, stripped of its authority, arriving at something he'd been carrying for 9 years. He thought about Ava Sinclair in the gray-haired woman's third-floor gallery seat at a congressional hearing, sitting very still, being present for all of it. He thought about what it actually meant to be the kind of person who held the line, not in the clean narrative version, not the version where the hero stands firm and the crowd parts and the truth arrives in cinematic light, the actual version. The version where you stand in a fluorescent-lit hangar at 8 in the evening with a worn-out inspection bag and a 9-year-old waiting at home, and everyone in the room is pushing in one direction, and you are the one thing pushing back, not because you're built differently or braver than other people, but because you understand specifically and in technical detail what the alternative looks like, and you cannot unknow that. That was the thing people didn't say about integrity. It wasn't a feeling. It wasn't a value you chose in the abstract. It was specific knowledge applied at the exact moment when it cost something. It was understanding the failure mode clearly enough that the pressure from the room stopped being the most important force in the room. The crack doesn't care about the timeline. The metal doesn't care about the deal. The fitting doesn't adjust its behavior based on the financial stakes or the number of important people waiting in the cabin. It does what physics tells it to do. And the only thing standing between that and the people who trust the system is someone who knows what the physics says and refuses to pretend otherwise. "Dad," Noah said from the table without looking up. "Is this angle right for a shear dominant load path?" Liam turned from the window and looked at the drawing. He walked over, looked at the protractor placement, looked at the geometry Noah had sketched out with the specific instinctive correctness of a kid who thought in load paths without knowing that's what they were called. "Almost," he said. "You want it 2 degrees steeper." "Why?" "Because you're transferring force between two components with different stiffness. The angle needs to account for the differential deflection under load." Noah looked at the drawing. He adjusted the angle. He looked at it again. "Better?" "Better." Noah wrote something in the margin, a note to himself, in the small, precise handwriting he'd developed over the past year. He looked at it, added something, and went back to work. Liam made dinner. Outside, the November evening completed its transition from day to dark, and the lights of the city held against it the way lights always did. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough was what the work asked for. Not perfection, not heroism, not the clean, finished version of things where everything resolved and everyone understood and the right answer arrived before anyone got hurt. Just enough. The right question at the right moment. The crack found before the cycle count ran out. The line held until the room caught up with what the metal already knew. That was the job. He had always known it was the job. He was glad, finally, that the job knew him back.